Hello and welcome to the Weekly Stuff Podcast with Jonathan Lack.
And Sean Chapman.
We are here to talk about stuff. This week on the show, we are bringing you a doubleheader of spoiler-filled reviews of two things we watched/played this summer that we loved. Final Fantasy XVI, the video game for PS5, and Justified City Primeval, the TV show on FX. And if you, like us, watched and want to listen to both of these reviews, you get a gold star, because they are very different, but we're doing them in one episode, because why the fuck not? We finished them both. Well, you finished Final Fantasy XVI a while ago. This TV show finished last week, so that's what we're talking about this week.
Yes, this is going to be an extra special episode of the podcast where I have to try to remember anything that happened in my life before I started playing Armored Core 6. and Final Fantasy 16, that's like, I finished that before fucking students showed up and the semester properly started. So that's like, well, that I finished it like a month ago, but that was like 5 years ago in Sean time.
It does, I will say, I finished Final Fantasy 16, I really loved it, and it speaks to how good that game is that I effectively fell off that game for a while because of other life stuff, and I was able to get back into it. A lot of JRPGs that's not possible with.
Yeah.
So, good game. Justified was great. You loved Justified too, right, Sean?
Oh, yes. Yeah, it is fucking amazing. Yeah, it is a pretty special thing of like it both captures so much of what I loved about the original show while also being pretty distinct from that original show. And it's a pretty cool magic trick they play with that thing.
I would agree with that completely, and I'm excited to talk about both of these things. If you only want to hear one review or the other, there are timestamps. You can skip around to your heart's content. That is fine. You will not offend us. But there you go. In terms of the stuff, Sean, I guess you want to start by talking about Armored Core 6?
Yeah, I've been spending, like, basically all my life has been for the past week or so has been Armored Core 6 and work. It's like kind of like the only things I've been doing. The last time I talked about it on the podcast, I had just started. I think I had only played like 2 or 3 hours. I wasn't even at the end of chapter 1 yet. And I think I'm like 2 missions maybe away from finishing it. Although I'm going to certainly do a New Game Plus. This feels like a game that is designed for you to do New Game Plus runs, to go through the older missions with like all of your parts and stuff. In fact, I probably could have finished the game because we ended up pushing our podcast recording time by about 30 minutes. I was like, I could probably finish this in 30 minutes. I was like, I don't want to finish Armored Core 6, like, while credits are rolling, run over to my PC and hit record on Audacity. So I decided, you know what, I'm just going to stop here, rather than try to push it. But, yeah, Armored Core 6 is fucking amazing. It's definitely right now, wrestling with Street Fighter 6 for my current favorite game of the year. It's a phenomenal game in so many ways. And I think one of the things that's really fascinating about it is you kind of have to rethink a lot of kind of how you assume video games work in certain ways to kind of like get your head around Armored Core 6. Because I think when I talked about it on the podcast, I didn't fully understand kind of really what the game was structurally. And it only really becomes clear, I think, as you kind of get into chapter 2. There are 5 chapters in the game, although like chapter 3 is by far the biggest one. That's kind of like the bulk of the game, that middle section. But the game is very different from any of the other modern From Software games in most ways. Like, if you like Dark Souls, that does not necessarily mean you're going to like Armored Core 6, but you definitely feel a fundamental design philosophy at From Software that they're just applying to like very different design problems that come up with like the kind of game that Armored Core 6 is compared to a Sekiro or Dark Souls. But that fundamental design philosophy is still has this element of like, they want you to really learn how to play the game, and they're going to put things like checkpoints in the game that make it so that's like you can't get past this section if you haven't really fundamentally learned what this game is asking you to do. But what Armored Core 6 is asking you to do is different than Dark Souls, because fundamentally when you hit a like difficulty spike in Armored Core 6, it is not about like you needing to get better at operating the controls. It's really not even as much about like you being able to identify like boss attack patterns and things like that. It's more about you looking at it and thinking, you know what? If I swapped this machine gun out for a rocket launcher, that probably would be better here. And maybe if I had these leg parts on, that would work better here. So it is very much a game that, like, when you hit a difficulty spike, what you need to do is go rethink your Armored Core build or swap out to another Armored Core. And then, like, every time I've hit something that felt really insanely hard to me, as soon as I back up, play around with my setup with my mech a little bit, and then I reapproach that boss fight, it's like you finish it in like 45 seconds, which literally that happened to me with a big boss I fought last night, and I was banging my head against it. I was like, you know what? This is stupid. I shouldn't just keep on dying against this boss over and over again. I backed out. I switched a couple of, or I didn't back out. I went into the menu at a checkpoint and swapped out a couple of parts, and then I just rinsed that thing in under a minute, and it felt incredibly satisfying. But that's the fundamental thing about Armored Core 6 that is awesome, is that it is so much about you tweaking and figuring out exactly what you want to do with your different mechs. And that's where, like, one of the biggest lessons I learned about how this game works that's very different than other games, that for people who haven't played yet or just getting into it and want some tips, one big thing that was a huge, like, paradigm shift for me was realizing that, like, that game does not have an economy the way that you think of most video games. There is no way for you to lose money in Armored Core 6, because whenever you buy a part, you can sell that part to the store for the exact amount of money that it is worth, which means that money is like almost kind of the wrong way to conceptualize it, because when you conceptualize money, you think about a thing that you can gain and also a thing that you can have a net loss. There's no way at all for you to lose money. Every time you complete a mission in Armored Core 6, you are increasing the total amount of parts you can own simultaneously, and that is the way to think about what that number is how many things can I own at one time. Because when I hit my first big difficulty spike against one of the harder early bosses, the thing I realized I needed to do was not just like swap out one or two parts, but just go back to the store. I realized, oh, I can sell stuff for the exact same amount it's worth. I sold every single thing I had to just get that raw number, and I just built a mech. And I was like, this is awesome, this is a different mech. And then I saved that pre-configured mech, and then I sold everything again, and I built a totally different mech. And I did that, and I made like 5 completely different mechs. And then you can go into your menu where you've saved all your pre-configurations, and you can basically buy them from there for the exact amount of money they're worth based on how many parts you currently have. So that like is, if people haven't played the game or just getting in, they haven't sort of seen that or figured that out yet, that is absolutely the way the game is meant to be played, is build a bunch of mechs, figure out all the different ones you want to have, save those different configurations, and then go buy the couple that you can own at one time, because I can currently have like 6 of them simultaneously. And the rad thing about Armored Core 6 is it's an incredibly like forgiving game compared to something like a Dark Souls. It is very generous with checkpoints and missions. When you return from a checkpoint, it will revive all of your health items. So it'll give you all those back at the checkpoint. It'll give you all of your ammo back at the checkpoint. You can, at any checkpoint when you've died, on like the restart screen, you can go into the like assembly menu and swap out parts on your current configured mech. And you can also go into basically like the garage menu. I don't remember what it's called, but like a menu where you can load any of your pre-configurations you currently own. And so if you are fighting one and you're like, oh my God, I thought this mission asked for a super lightweight mech, but actually like my crazy giant tank with 500 fucking rocket launchers on it would be way better here. When you die, you can just load that from your menu and restart the checkpoint from that point with that different armored core. And so the game is like very much designed for you to be messing around with every single mech you can think of, swap all the parts out, swap all the weapons out. There's a really robust training menu in the configuration, like the assembly screen, that allows you to, on like in a training room while you're fighting AI, go just pause and you can swap any part on your currently assembled mech that you want in the middle of training without having to go to a loading screen. So you can be like, here's 2 different rocket launchers, like which one works better on my mech? Let me try this one for 30 seconds. Press pause, swap out the other one. Let me try this one for 30 seconds. And that's like so much fun. That's like so much of the fun I'm having with the game is just messing around with the mech stuff, especially once you get into chapter 3 where you unlock a lot of different parts. And I currently have, I think, over a dozen different mechs I've built that are all like extremely different, have super different play styles. And last night I went into like almost all of my old mechs and messed around with them and swapped out parts and made like new versions of them. And I spent like 2 hours last night past when I was planning to go to bed, because I was like, oh, I'll spend 5 minutes, because I had this idea of, oh, if I swapped out that for this, that would probably make this like an even better build. And then I realized, oh my God, I can make like a sick assassin mech with all the lightest parts and just like a pistol, a missile launcher, and a laser dagger, because it was a new weapon I just unlocked on my left arm. And I just made this really sick assassin mech that has like no health, but if you just get up on top of your enemies and you just stab them to death, and it's like a shank mech, and it's fucking sick. And I spent like an hour tweaking that to try to make it as good as it could be. And then I spent another hour reloading old missions with this new mech build, trying it out and just like assassinating enemy mechs. And it was awesome. The story is also like really compelling. It's not a sort of traditional story. It's not a Last of Us. You know, you're not getting big cutscenes. Like I said last time I talked about it on the podcast, there are no human like models on the screen ever. All the story is delivered through radio chatter in missions and on like radio chatter in between missions when you're like just looking at your mech in your hangar. But I've like where I'm at in the story, which is right at the end, there's a split choice that I assume breaks out. Like, I know there are multiple endings in the game, and I believe this is like the main choice that determines which ending you get. And that choice I have to make, which is effectively like a who lives or who dies choice, is so fucking hard that I'm glad there's a New Game Plus, so I get to see the other route and all that kind of stuff, because it's one of the reasons I want to play it again, is because it's like you kind of can't help everybody. And it's, you know, this game, the story in the game is so much about all these different factions who are all interested in this coral substance, which is like this, you know, sci-fi kind of thing that makes their crazy technology work on this planet Rubicon. And all these corporations and government interests and then private interests and then the people living on Rubicon, all of them want this coral and want it for different reasons. And you are an independent mercenary taking jobs from all these different factions, and kind of, you know, you kind of become friendly with everybody and kind of see everyone's perspective, even as you know, like, okay, the people at the top of this company are like absolute fucking bastards, but a lot of the the individual like mech pilots that work for them are just guys working for them and are cool, and like they don't deserve to just be gunned down because, you know, they happen to be working for the wrong people, because that's the corporate reality you live in. And yet you gotta gun some of those fuckers down, because that's the way it goes. And it's really like a very kind of dark, solemn, brutal story about being a mercenary in this just very harsh corporate world driven by these corporate interests that are burning everything to the ground. And then there are a couple of factions that are definitely like trying to work for something that feels more positive. And yeah, all the character stuff is very From Software in that way, of that it's light on the story, but it's super evocative, and you can feel that there's a lot of thought and care that went into this world. And from what I understand by looking things up, this is also a new continuity, which is not something I knew. Apparently the Armored Core franchise has rebooted its internal continuity every few games or so, and this is the beginning of a different one. So if you've not played any of the older Armored Cores, like this coral stuff, which I had assumed was like a thing in the whole franchise, they invented that for this game. And so that all that story stuff, you can actually get on the ground floor here and not be missing anything. Although there are definitely some references that I realized, like, okay, this must be a reference to something from the older games. I'm pretty sure that your call sign Raven is a reference to stuff that is like in the older Armored Core games, in terms of like a spiritual successor kind of thing. But yeah, it is just like this incredible game that is also, with all the stuff I've already said, the other big thing is that it just plays immaculately. Like, there is no more just perfect mech game you could possibly find. The feel of the controls is so exact, and if you have a kind of fantasy from watching mecha anime that you want to like realize in the game in terms of a kind of play style, the game is going to accommodate that, and it's going to like accommodate that in the most like viscerally satisfying way possible. Whether you're making your big crazy tanks, whether you're making your super lithe like stabby assassin mechs, whether you're making like energy weapon based mechs, or like some of like the weirder kind of stranger designs that you can make in the game that are like almost like some of the weird like mobile armors almost in Gundam and stuff like that. Like, there's such a wide variety of parts and weird weapons and stuff you can unlock, and all of them feel so satisfying to play, which is why you want to build a dozen different mechs, or dozens and dozens of mechs at some point, so that you can experiment with all the play styles and see how all the weapons work. And because every single way of playing the game feels so fun, you're really incentivized to experiment in that way. So yeah, this game, I have not been able to stop thinking about it since I like really got into it. After I beat Act 1 is when I just kind of got obsessed with it. And I'm like daydreaming about fucking the way this game plays when I'm at work. Like I'm sitting there grading and then my mind wanders and I'm just like picturing my main mech, which is my favorite one that I've called Rhongominiad. I'm naming all my mechs after mythological weapons. Rhongominiad is King Arthur's lance. And it is a very lithe, mobile mech that I've got a shotgun in my right hand. I've got a like drone, like basically like a funnel in Gundam context thing that flies around and shoots laser blasts for me. And then I've got a rocket launcher in my left hand that I can swap for a pile bunker, which the pile bunker is that like big like construction looking apparatus that just is like a huge pneumatic spike. If you've watched Iron-Blooded Orphans, there's a lot of pile bunkers in Iron-Blooded Orphans. And so the play style for that mech is just be very agile, dodging around, letting my funnel start to like break down their stamina a little bit because there's a stagger gauge, kind of like a Sekido or something like that. And the shotgun is really good against breaking their stagger meter, and so is the rocket launcher. And it's about peppering with that stuff to break their stagger meter and then getting in close. And the charge shot with the pile bunker is like the most, like you have to be standing right fucking next to them for it to land. It is the most melee attack in the game. I think it is also the most damaging thing in the game that I've seen so far is that charged attack. So it's very hard to land, but once you get used to it and you can time the wind up, because it's like a Falcon Punch in Smash Brothers. It's like this huge wind up. You got to be right on top of them. So the only way to land it is to stun them. But when you land it, it just fucking melts anything. And it is so fucking fun. And you're like flying up and there's like huge capital ships that are like flying in the atmosphere, raining lasers down on a city. And you zoom up there, like dodging missile fire as the capital ship's firing missiles at you. You stop, like, you know, break right in front of the fucking control room on the top of the ship, take out the pile bunker and just boom and fire a big spike in it. And the whole ship fucking explodes. And then you fly away and do that on 3 other ships while your boost gauge is still up. It's the fucking most perfect Gundam game that is not technically Gundam ever made. So if people are not playing Armored Core 6, The Fires of Rubicon, people should get on that shit.
That sounds awesome. I would absolutely love to play it. There's too many games this year, but that is one that sounds pretty great. I did start... So I should say, my stuff recently has really just been Final Fantasy XVI, because I kind of made a beeline to finish that game the last couple days of just like, let's do nothing else and finish that. I did finish it last night. That's why we're talking about it today. And I did then go... I'd been holding off on buying it until I finally finished Final Fantasy, but then I went and bought Baldur's Gate 3 on PS5 because I've been excited to try that game. I could actually play it on my Mac. My Mac can run it, and it's got a Mac client and all of that, but it is like a 200 gigabyte game. Like, that's... I can't... My PS5 has the storage for that. I'm not putting it on my work computer, you know? So that's why I wound up getting it on PS5. And I have only played like 2 hours of it, and at least an hour of that was character creation, so I can't really comment on it, except to say that I am very excited, and I am thinking about it while you were talking about Armored Core, because I'm just like, I want to go play around with Baldur's Gate 3 more, because I understood like 1% of what I was seeing, but it seems really exciting. And yeah, the funniest thing is they really did. I can't say how well it will hold up long term, but I was impressed initially at how overhauled it is to be run on a console with a controller, because I've seen a ton of Baldur's Gate 3 footage from the PC version, which has been out in early access for like 2 years. Yeah. And all the UI stuff is different. The character creation screen, even that, like, and that was actually impressive to me because they even rethought how all of the character creation looks, everything to be more natural with a controller, which in combat means radial menus up the ass, which is hilarious. But it is cool so far. I am having fun. As soon as I got to like the first dice roll, and I was like, oh, this is cool. You know, more because a lot of games technically have dice rolls going on in them. You just don't see it. I like a game that just gives you the fucking dice roll. It's great.
Yeah, I definitely want to get into Baldur's Gate 3 at some point here also. And yeah, when I saw some of the video footage and saw that, yeah, when you do a dice roll, because for people who don't know, Baldur's Gate is a Dungeons and Dragons franchise, effectively, like the old games, but it also is like Baldur's Gate exists in the Forgotten Realms, which is an official D&D setting. So those old Baldur's Gate games, which I've messed around with, those are also just like based on D&D rules. But yeah, I love that they have a screen that you just see the actual dice being rolled, and that's like it's such a eureka moment of why the fuck haven't these games been doing this the whole time? That's so much more interesting than, you know, in your like Bethesda style RPG where it says persuasion 55% on in brackets in front of a conversation option, and you just pick it and it's like brackets failed or brackets success, and then you just get whatever dialogue it is. It's way better to get you want the drama of of seeing chance play out. And that's what's fun about actual Dungeons, or one of the things that's fun about actual Dungeons and Dragons, or any of those kinds of tabletop games, is seeing, you know, fortune play you for a fool as these dice are rolling around and you get a fucking critical miss on something that you really wanted to land, you know. Like that's just, when I saw that was the thing that made me really, really want to play that game more than just knowing that it's good. Obviously, it reviewed insanely well, but it was seeing that gave me that sense of, okay, these people get what is cool about this kind of game in a like practical or real world sense, and trying to translate even more of that into the digital world is, I think, like a really smart idea.
And I have never played Larian's last game, which was Divinity Original Sin 2, but I really wanted to play that as well, and I just kind of never got around to it, and then I was like, well, I'll play Baldur's Gate 3, which is their next big one that's like even more acclaimed, and I am excited to get into it. For those wondering what did I do for my character, I went with a bard because that looked fun. And I was reading about the different things you can do with the bard, and it's both, there's cool combat stuff, and then a lot of the kind of stuff I like in this kind of game, which is like conversation initiatives and all sorts of things like that. So that sounded fun, and I gave my bard a violin, and he is a half elf from the woodland. He's a woodland half elf, which means he has stealth stuff. And I made him look, I like rolled a bunch of like random faces until I found one I kind of liked, and then adjusted it from there, but he's got a cool goatee and everything. It looks good. I had fun with the character creator. It did take like at least an hour just going through all the ridiculous number of choices you have, because it's full. It's D&D it's D&D 5th edition. All of that is in there. It's a lot. It's a lot to go through, but I had fun with it. And again, I have no idea what I'm doing, but I'm having fun so far. And the music is beautiful, because I feel like a good chunk of the soundtrack on the character creation screen, because it just rolls through a bunch of it, and it's great.
That's good, yeah.
So, yeah. And it's got those, you know, big CGI cutscenes to open that are really sweet. It starts with all the stuff with the mind flayers, who are the big fucking, like, squid guys who are attacking you, and all of that. So I'm enjoying it. It's exactly what it promises, and that's fun.
Awesome, yeah.
Yeah, so that's what I've been up to. I have some other things I could talk about, just little movie things and stuff, but I think we should just get into the main meat of this episode, Sean, because we've got a lot to get to. Do you want to talk about Justified first?
Sure.
Let's do it. It's how I had it ordered on my outline, so let's start there.
I mean, there's no right order. There's no wrong order. It's it's either neo-Western cowboy or it's JRPG. So neither of those can segue into the other in whatever order we do. So let's tackle Justified City Primeval first.
Let's take it first, because it is the more recent thing to have finished. Final Fantasy came out like back in June. But anyway, so yes, skip ahead. If you don't want to hear the Justified thing, you can look down at the timestamps and you can jump ahead to the Final Fantasy conversation or whatever. Or if you don't care about either of these things, we'll see you later. But for now, let's talk about Justified. You and I have talked about this on the show before. I finally watched the original run, which was 6 seasons on FX earlier this year. And I think we both agree that's one of the great American TV shows. And
one might say it's one of the best 10 TV shows ever made.
Yes, it was on your top 10. It would be on my top 10 now. I hadn't seen it when we last did a TV top 10, but it would absolutely be on mine too. I think it's got one of the best, I think it's got the best final season of a TV show I've ever seen for like at least a drama. And I think it has absolutely one of the best finales. I guess it's competition. There would be Better Call Saul. Better Call Saul would be the other one for me that is like one of the best final seasons. It's a little different on the ending, because Better Call Saul has several endings because of its prequel nature, but Justified has like just the perfect final scene with Raylan and Boyd and all of that. And so I think obviously if you're ever going to do a revival of that show, the worry is how do you deal with sort of the perfectness of that ending. And I think City Primeval did the absolute smartest thing they could have done, which is that, hey, this is based on an Elmore Leonard book. Elmore Leonard, in his lifetime, was ludicrously why am I
Prolific.
stumbling over this word? Prolific. He was ludicrously prolific. He had a lot of books. We could drop Raylan Givens into kind of any of them because he's like the ultimate Elmore Leonard character, both on the page and then also I think as he was written in the series, they just kept bringing in Elmore Leonard inspirations. So they took this book, City Primeval, High Noon in Detroit, which is pretty old at this point. That's from the 80s, I think. It's from 1980. And they took that book. The original main character of that is a character named Raymond Cruz, a detective who's in another couple of Elmore Leonard's books. And you actually do see that character briefly in the show, played by Paul Calderon, who also played him in the movie Out of Sight with George Clooney. But otherwise, they take that role, they give it to Raylan Givens. A lot of the other stuff is very direct from the book. The stuff with the judge and Clement Mansell, the Oklahoma Wild Man, is very close. I did read a little bit of that book when this was before the show premiered. I was at the dentist, and it was taking them forever to get to me. So I just got the sample from Kindle, and I just read however long that was, and that was fun. I kind of would love to go back and read the rest of it, but from what I could tell, all of that is taken very faithfully in the show. And so what you have is a show that is, I would say, more of a like offshoot of Justified. It's a spin-off with Raylan than it is a real like continuation of the original 6 seasons, because nobody else from the show is in it until the very final minutes of the series. It's just Raylan. His daughter, I guess, is a character in the original show, but only as a baby, so it's very different here. And that's what they did. And so you have a show that this is, it's differently structured. This is much more of an 8-part miniseries than it is an ongoing TV show. All the characters are new. The setting is different. The cinematography is very different. They gave it a different composer. Mark Isham did the music for this one instead of the composer of the original series. But you've got Timothy Olyphant there looking better than ever at the center of this show. And I just think it works fucking beautifully.
Yeah, it's amazing because it is just like, you know, there is a certain je ne sais quoi of Justified that is there for sure. Like, if you liked Justified, the TV show, like, you're gonna love this miniseries. Like, I can't imagine the person that liked the show and didn't like this.
And we should mention, like, all the people who worked on it are Justified people.
Yeah.
It's Dave Andron and Michael Dinner ran the show. Graham Yost, who ran Justified, was not involved in this because he was busy elsewhere. But those were, like, his 2 top lieutenants. Michael Dinner directed the pilot and many episodes throughout the series. They were both writers. Chris Provenzano and Taylor Elmore, who are also writers on the original, wrote here. There were only 2 writers who weren't involved in the original, and the directors were all there. So, like, this is very much like an in-the-family continuation, which is not always what you get with this kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's like if you liked Justified, you will love City Primeval, but then also it is a very different beast. Like, it is a distinct thing. It has such a distinct flavor that comes with this. It's much less neo-Western, right? It's because you're not in the South. You're losing that kind of element there. And it's more that, like, Raylan kind of brings... Well, it's Raylan and Clement Mansell are the 2 characters in Detroit that are bringing, like, this neo-Western, Old West lawman, like, outlaw philosophy into Detroit, which is a city that doesn't want and isn't asking for this shit. And it's like Detroit operates on, like, classic crime fiction logic, and then Raylan and Clement operate on neo-Western logic, and there's like this interesting clash there that also is like racialized in certain ways, right? Because you have like your white characters and black characters on the show, and all the white characters are like coming here from somewhere else, and all the black people are living here in Detroit, and these white people are bringing their bullshit with them and like fucking everything up. And yeah, and so it's like all of that just has a very different style. And then also it's, you know, it's much more of a kind of police procedural / detective story in a way that Justified original was not so much, right? Like, Raylan is a U.S. Marshal. He's not a cop, which this show has to sort of like wrangle some shit to justify. God damn it. It's hard shit to talk about without making puns. But to justify why Raylan is doing all this cop shit when he's a marshal, he shouldn't be doing all this. But they come up with a justification, and it's like, I don't care that it's sort of a stretch that he would be involved in this case so deep in this way. But that like means that he's working with like police officers and doing police officer shit in a way that, you know, obviously Justified in the original is police procedural adjacent. Like, the U.S. Marshals are a form of law enforcement. But I think one of the ways that that show is able to feel much more Western in its style is that he's not actually a cop. And so he gets to feel more like this kind of old school sheriff than a like police officer would be in a modern set story.
Yes, and it's such a great structure because it allows the show to do very different things than it did before, and it allows for a really different exploration of Raylan as a character because he's in such different weird settings. And I think that one of the things I was most impressed with is that as different as it is also, I think, a really good continuation for his character and almost like an epilogue, kind of a coda-style story for him from who he became over the course of that original series. Because even though they never really directly reference anything that happened on the original Justified, it's all there in his character. And like Timothy Olyphant is doing a lot of quiet acting across the course of this series where he is evoking, you know what Raylan is thinking about in certain moments. That is like evoking things he dealt with in Harlan that is kind of in his past. With the main, this is one of the most interesting things they do from the Elmore Leonard book, is in the book, Raymond Cruz is much more like Raylan from the early seasons of Justified, where he's kind of a wild guy. Like he will, you know, he's more quick on the trigger, and he is trying to get Clement Mansell in a position where they can have an old-fashioned shootout because he thinks that's the best way to deal with him. And I think the most interesting adaptational choice they make is that Raylan is not trying to do that in this show. He has, like, that is his biggest character growth, is he no longer is trying to just shoot Clement Mansell. One of my favorite moments in the whole fucking show is at the end of episode 2 when Clement is basically threatening his daughter at the hotel. And I love that scene because in any other season of Justified, with any other person, Raylan would have just walked up to the table and shot Clement in the face, right? Like, he would be so fucking dead if that were any other scenario. And because his daughter is there, and because Raylan has moved on in his life in a lot of ways, he doesn't. And his goal throughout most of the series is to do things the right way, even though as he learns, that's not really the Detroit way. And I think that whole, like, element of the show mixed with this sort of police procedural thing they're doing that Justified hasn't done before makes it also like a really dynamic continuation of this character who is so fucking great.
Yeah, and it is, like, at the center of it, it is their extension of Raylan's character arc and his growth from the original show that I think is my favorite part of City Primeval, and it's the thing that anchors it as being a properly, like, Justified show, because, yeah, like, you get the sense that if this was, like, mid-Justified Raylan, he would have finished this in a couple of episodes. Like, Clement Mansell, and it's a thing that Raylan comments on multiple times. As you get deeper into the season, he starts to realize, like, this Clement Mansell dude is not a big deal. Like, this dude should have been fucking got forever ago. Like, how have we not either caught or killed this guy? And, you know, it's because he's trying to go about it the right way, and he doesn't realize that, like, the other officers that are working this case don't really give a shit about that. Like, they don't really care about what happens with Clement Mansell. And they just want to be able to put somebody away, right? They just want, like, everything to seem nice, to be able to, like, get a political win here, and they don't really care about if Clement Mansell is technically on the loose, whether he's the one who did the murder. Like, that's outside the care of, like, a lot of what, like, the, like, top police people are doing there. And because Raylan is trying to do this by the book in a world that isn't working by the book, he just can't fucking get Clement Mansell. And if Raylan had given in to his sort of older instincts, like, he would have just fucking gotten in the gunfight with that dude in episode 2 or 3, and it would have been over, but it would have been bloody and brutal, right? And so Raylan is trying to avoid going back to that at any way possible, right? He is not trying to find a way to create a justified shooting on this dude, which was his MO in that old show. And that is just such a fascinating place for the character to be in. I think Timothy Olyphant plays it so perfectly because it's very identifiably Raylan Givens the whole time, but you're seeing a very different side of this guy, and making him a really compelling heroic character that isn't giving into his anger and isn't giving into his violence is pretty fascinating, because that's just so much of the engine of Justified, and a lot of shows like this are about the joy of seeing a person who you know can be very good giving into that violence and exacting it on the world. That's Breaking Bad, that's Sopranos, that's all these kinds of shows. And it's really interesting to see Raylan is doing everything in his power to avoid that outcome.
Yes, it's. I talked about this when I talked about Justified Season 6, that one of the key distinctions between Justified and a lot of the shows it aired next to in the 2000s and 2010s is that it's not an anti-hero show. Like, Raylan is the hero of the show, and he does bad shit and stupid shit consistently, but it is a story about him becoming a better person, ultimately. And I think they honor that in really interesting ways, and part of that is, for the first half of the season, they have him next to his daughter. Literally, because it is Timothy Olyphant and his literal daughter Vivian playing Willa Givens. And of course, Raylan's daughter is a major force in the original show because I think his ex-wife gets pregnant in like season 3 and then gives birth at the end of 4, and then the baby is around in 5 and 6. Obviously, it's a baby; it's never really a character, and it is more a symbol of like what Raylan is pulled between the job and his family and these sorts of things, and whether or not he can balance those out. But in this show, we actually properly have him. They've actually advanced the clock further than it would be in the real world, which I think is interesting, so that she can be like a fully autonomous teenager. She's 15 years old. She's like entering high school, and we have her here. And I love every choice they made around him and his daughter. It's so great. Casting Vivian Olyphant, I think, was fucking brilliant because she's very much not an actress. This is her first time ever acting in anything other than like school plays, I think. So she is not mannered in the way every other person who has ever passed through Justified is. Justified is a show of big performances by big character actors, right? And Vivian Olyphant is just a fucking kid over here who happens to have really great chemistry with Timothy Olyphant because they are father and daughter. And I think there's something so grounding about that in the early episodes where I have just a massive smile on my face when they're on screen because, like, Raylan's actually a pretty good fucking dad. The first thing we see him do in the show is get his daughter an ice cream cone because that's who Raylan Givens is. And I think they have a really interesting back and forth, and you're constantly seeing how Raylan's, internal equation of what he's doing in Detroit is informed by his daughter in multiple directions. And I think it's really well done.
Yeah, it's one of those early things you encounter in the show that I feel like really centers you around what the show is trying to do, because it's such a great performance and such a great piece of writing as well, where it is such an authentic teenager, yes. And that relationship is so authentic because it is literally authentic, but it's like the way that Willa is written is like she talks like a teenager, right? And then the way that Vivian Olyphant plays her like it is the way that actual teenagers talk. And I'm not just an old dude who's saying like this is what teens are like. I know because I spent 2 days ago I interacted with 80 teenagers in one day. Well, at bare minimum, those are the number of students I interacted with. It would be like over 100, including all the kids in the hallway and stuff. So I spend a lot of time around teenagers, and it's like it is very real, and it's not we hired a 23-year-old girl who looks younger to play a teenager. And I think that what that does for the show is it really grounds Raylan. And as you say, it's a thing that even when at about the midpoint Willa leaves and she goes home, that the whole time, like the thing that is keeping Raylan who he is that he's trying to be a better person for her. He doesn't want to be this violent, brutal killer like he used to be, because he doesn't want that to be who Willa's father is, right? Like you have that key moment at the end of episode 2 where Clement pushes Raylan by threatening his daughter. Raylan gives in for a moment in a very classic Timothy Olyphant beatdown style. He did that on Justified and he did that on Deadwood all the time. He's just gonna kick the shit out of this dude, and he beats the shit out of Clement. His daughter is watching. He gets up, he looks, he sees her, and she's crying. And that's how episode 2 ends. And that's and after that point, Raylan doesn't do anything particularly violent until the very, very end, right? I mean, you definitely feel him, it's building, and his frustration and anger with Clement Mansell and everything that's going on builds. But this isn't a show where you're not going to look up what are the coolest gunfight scenes in Justified City Primeval, in the way that I'll look at those YouTube compilations for the original show, because there's a bunch of really cool shootout in standoff scenes and stuff like that. Every season would have a couple in the classic Justified. City Primeval, it doesn't really do that. Even when you have it, it doesn't really do it, because that's not what this show is about, because Raylan is such a different person, and all that is centered by that relationship right at the very beginning with his daughter.
Yes. And it's, again, I just have to stress that scene at the end of episode 2, which I think is so dynamite in all the ways you're describing. Clement Mansell is the luckiest person in all of Justified.
Yes.
Right? If he had threatened literally anyone else, he would have died at the table. Like, if that had been Raylan's wife, or ex-wife, I guess, but, like, there are multiple scenes in the original Justified where a villain threatens Raylan's, like, ex-wife, and he shoots the guy in front of her, right? Like, that happens there's that scene, I think it's in the beginning of season 3, there's the dude who likes to do the trick with the knife, and Raylan pulls and that's, like, in their hotel room. And I'm just thinking, like, Clement Mansell is the luckiest motherfucker in the world, because he picked the wrong guy to mess with, but he picked the right person to threaten because it's the one person he won't shoot someone in front of. It's hilarious. Like, that scene, like, I remember getting to the end of episode 2 and I was like, started laughing as the credits rolled, not because what happened was funny, but as like this release of energy, because you can just, it's so, Clement Mansell does not know what he just walked away from, and it's amazing.
Yeah, as you get that sense throughout the whole season, is that, like, Clement Mansell is a dude who is completely in over his head, doesn't realize it, and the whole world is conforming around him to make sure that he is able to get away with a lot of his bullshit. Like, he's so incredibly lucky and has just been kind of, like, stumbling into all of this stuff. But that's, like, so that's what makes his character so fascinating and fun, is that it's like, because you saw the original Justified, this guy is not a Boyd Crowder. Like, he is not on that fucking level. He's not that good. He can't control himself. He doesn't have, like, the long-term planning skills or anything like that. He is charismatic as a character, but he's not charismatic to other people in that world. Like, we as the audience, I think you kind of love him because he's so awful, but in such a compelling way. But other people in the world fucking hate this dude. Whereas everybody loves Boyd. Even when they hate him, they love Boyd because he is really charming and he's very good at, like, using those skills. And Clint Mansell has none of that shit. He is just a, like, weird tornado of a man who has come into all these people's lives, but because Detroit doesn't actually give a shit about taking out this guy, like, he keeps on getting to scrape by, and Raylan is just there being like, if only this was me in Miami, in, like, the mid-2000s, I would have just shot this dude at the fucking table.
But, like, around that, as you were talking about earlier, I think the setting of Detroit, the racial dynamics of the series, the way our entire, like, pop cultural conversation around law enforcement has evolved since Justified went off the air initially, like, all of that is in the mixer here. And so you have a show that is, like the original Justified, both ludicrously entertaining. Just on a moment-to-moment level, there's, like, nothing more entertaining you can turn on your television, but it is also really smart and soulful and interesting. I think we should just pick apart some of the characters here, because I made this tweet, I think, after the 6th episode, which I think that's the one that ends with Sweetie dying at the bar. But you also have a lot of stuff with Carolyn, the defense attorney, in that episode about kind of her backstory. And I made this tweet where I said, I know this is a crazy thing to say about a show with, like, the deepest bench of character actors in TV history, but Justified City Primeval might have the best cast of any Justified season. And, like, I don't know if I could actually back that up, but it feels true when I look at the list. Like, the people in this season are out of this world. You have Vaughn Curtis Hall, who I love, and I don't think I've ever seen in something that quite plays to his strengths as well as this. And he's Sweetie, the owner of the bar, who Clement Mansell is working with. You have Boyd Holbrook, obviously, as Clement Mansell, which is going to be confusing later on when we talk about Boyd Crowder. Because you have Boyd Holbrook playing Clement and Walton Goggins playing Boyd Crowder. It's all confusing. You've got Victor Williams as Detective Robinson at Detroit PD. You've got Marin Ireland. You've got Norbert Leo Butts, who's on every detective show ever made. You've got Adelaide Clemens as Sandy, which is Clemens' like girlfriend. She's so great. And then you've got Anjanou Ellis as effectively our co-lead as Carolyn, the defense attorney who becomes the judge at the end. And then a bunch of people passing in and out like Keith David and Paul Calderon and characters like that. And then at the very end, they even work in Luis Guzman just because they're, again, Justified likes collecting character actors, and it is a ludicrously rich ensemble.
Yeah, it's crazy. I mean, it's, if you just want to like enjoy like really good actors getting really good dialogue, which is always like one of like the sort of essential joys of Justified, like this definitely carries on that tradition. It's like, man, when you get into episode 1 and you realize that like one of that, he's only a guest star, so he's only prime, like really in episode 1 because he gets taken out. But that Keith David's going to be a big part of that first episode. You're like, oh my God, how has Keith David never been on Justified before? It's such a perfect, like, special kind of character actor. And like him being kind of like the centerpiece of that first episode and really the inciting incident of the whole plot is just incredibly fun. But yeah, I mean, every single performance down the line, whether it's a like main character that's in every single episode or a smaller performance that's only in a couple, every actor is turning in a 10 out of 10, like perfect performance.
Yeah, they're all fucking great. The Keith David of it all, that the show starts effectively because Timothy Olyphant pisses off Keith David is so great. I was rewatching the first like 20 minutes of the premiere this morning, and it is so good when they get in the courtroom and Keith David basically threatens to have Raylan's daughter put in jail because she's laughing at cat videos on her phone. And Raylan turns to him and goes, it's kind of surprising no one's tried to kill you before. and it's just like the exact wrong thing to say, but Raylan is still a shithead, and it's so good. And of course, like, because it's Keith David, you can also buy that this is a guy who has had an outsized presence in Detroit for 30 years, which is what the entire plot turns on, is that he was this guy who was like very corrupt, had this book of corruption, and everybody is maneuvering to get it. And Raylan doesn't even realize this until like the second to last episode, how deep this goes. But I think if you had anyone other than Keith David, I don't know if you could sell that, but it's Keith fucking David, so you can sell it. Anything.
Yeah, it's so good. Like, it's just such a memorable character, right? Because even though he's only in that first episode, that character's ghost hangs over the whole show. And it's, you're right. It's like you can so buy that this character, Judge Guy, would have had such a control over everything that everyone is kind of afraid of the power, all the information that he had and all these deals he had made and who he had put away and who he had let go. And it's just such a memorable performance that just Brian shines so brightly in that first episode, and then he's snuffed out. You're like, God damn it, Clement Mansell. I mean, I know that the Judge Guy was an absolute piece of shit, but, he was also fucking great. The monster, how could you kill him?
And that is just how the book City Primeval opens, is with a long description of who this judge is and like his influence, because it's what the whole story is about. And I can just imagine them sitting and reading that and going, who haven't we cast in Justified who we've always needed to cast? And Keith David is probably very high on that list. And that's something about this season, is because they're in Detroit and not like the backwaters of Kentucky, there's a lot more black actors to hire, like, and roles for black characters. And so they really just fill up the ranks with great, African-American character actors, starting with him, going to everybody else. Who else should we talk about here? Should we just have to talk about Clement Mansell right now, because we were already talking about him a little bit, and obviously it hangs over the whole season. Boyd Holbrook is someone I've always liked when I've seen him in various things, and I don't think I've ever loved him to the degree I think he just fits this show like a fucking glove, in that, like, he's absolutely one of the most entertaining Justified antagonists, but I think it's a better version of something they tried doing in season 3 of Justified with the Neil McDonough character, who is also entertaining and a little, like, in over his head. And I think there's something about this being, because this is the element of the book that is most directly translated into the show, is my understanding, is everything with Clement and all the stuff like him having his shitty music he does and walking around basically naked in a robe in that apartment they're stealing and all of that stuff. He is the most fucking Elmore Leonard character ever. And the performance is so in touch with that, and it is so entertaining.
Yeah, it's incredible, because he's like the co-lead of the show, right? In this classic Justified fashion, like, right. It is, you have like the Raylan side, and then you've got the Clement side, and the kind of like how you used to have the Raylan side and the Boyd side. And in some ways, Clement is more Boyd than he is the like season villain of a old Justified season, like, because there is so much time of the show is spent showing scenes from his perspective. Like, you're just with him, with his own cast of characters, right? Because you have a lot of characters like Sandy, who is a main character in the show, who barely interacts with Raylan, right? She's got a couple of scenes with Raylan, but she's in so much of the show. Obviously, you have like Sweetie is one of the main characters that kind of lives a little bit in both worlds, because he's got his relationship with Carolyn, but he's mostly in Clement's side of things. So it's like he's kind of like just a second POV character. And yeah, he's so compelling because he is that kind of classic force of nature sort of character, which they very much kind of lampshade, right? He's got his Joker-esque thing that he does where he tells his backstory about his mom and her being carried away by a fucking tornado or whatever, and then later you get what feels like is probably the more real version, which is why that he killed his mom after she slept with some dude who worked at the mining town or whatever. Or maybe it wasn't either of those things. You never really know for sure. But that sense of him just being this fucking like idiot, like he's this violent, brutal idiot who is going through his life fucking up every single thing he runs into, and because he has no like restraint, he has nothing that is holding him back. He just wants to take whatever he wants, and he also wants to be kind of in that Boyd Crowder way. He wants to be an outlaw. He wants to be the Oklahoma wild man. He wants to be this like guy who is feared and loved for the things that he can do and is able to live this extravagant life based on the crimes that he commits. But, it's this running thing throughout the whole show. This is something I'd be curious about the book, like how much of this is, like there are elements of this in the book because it feels so modern, is he can't get cash from anyone because no one has any fucking cash. Like, what is he robbing, right? He wants to, for Clement Mansell, the ideal world would be there's a bunch of fucking like stagecoaches riding between old west towns, and he's on a horse with a fucking like bandana around his mouth, and he has his 6-shooters, right? And he's pulling them over, and he's just like a highwayman. Like, that's what he wants to be. He wants to be this sort of classic outlaw, but that's just not, that doesn't exist anymore. That's not the way the world works. And so all of the violence and all the awful shit he enacts on everybody he runs into is so fruitless. It's all for nothing. It's for fucking chump change, right? Like he makes such a pitiful amount of money in this movie that it's like, I'm like, I've got more money. Like, I make more money in a year than you're stealing and you're murdering people for, dude. Like, get a fucking job at McDonald's and work a couple months and you'll get a couple $1,000. Like, Jesus Christ. It's so petty, everything he does. And that's what I think, like, the engine of that character is like, he is so fun to watch and he's like unpredictable and he's weird and crazy. And I think like Boyd Holbrook is just such a compelling person, but everything he's doing is so fruitless and so pointless and he just can't see it.
Absolutely. And like, I think I would have to imagine that in the book, because the book is 1980, it's very old at this point, that I think a lot of his crimes probably make more sense. I actually think, though, updating that to 2023 makes the character all the more interesting, as you're saying, because he is, at his heart, he's an analog villain from like the Old West days in the wrong era, which also makes him the perfect Justified villain because that's who Timothy Olyphant, or that's who Raylan is. And I think Boyd Holbrook has a similar quality to Timothy Olyphant, where I remember before Deadwood, before Justified, Timothy Olyphant, I think everyone could tell he was talented. And he was in a lot of things that he didn't work in because he doesn't feel like a modern person, right? Like, no one remembers this. He's the original Hitman in the Hitman movie. He's Agent 47 in the original Hitman. He's the villain who's a big computer hacker in Die Hard 4, which sounds crazy when I say it now, because if we know anything about Raylan Givens, it's that he fucking hates his computer. I don't know if that's even a plot point. I just remember every time he gets to his desk at the marshal's office, he ignores his computer because he doesn't want to use it. That's not who he is. And I think when you put him in Deadwood and then you put him in Justified, it's like, okay, the answer is he's an Old West dude. And the thing that works about Justified is that Raylan Givens is an Old West dude who is out of time and he's wearing the big hat. And so it's no surprise that Timothy Olyphant has played martial characters in like 7 other things since Justified. It's just who he is. And I think Boyd Holbrook, if you look at like his like filmography, he's run through a lot of like modern westerns. He's actually one of the main villains in Logan. I had forgotten this, but he just looks like a dude who belongs in the Old West. And so you put him in this, and he's so a man out of time. And he is just kind of, as you say, he's a bull in a china shop, bumping into shit. And he needs to be stopped because he is violent and he is killing people. But he does not need to be stopped in the sense of like, some of the big like crime families in the original Justified who are like, flooding the Harlan County with drugs or something like that, right? He does not have a bigger plan that is going to disrupt society, but he is violent and shitty.
Yeah, and I think one of like the great things about the story of the show is that like this is a thing that it takes a while for all of our hero characters to catch on to, is that he did not kill Judge Guy for any reason other than road rage, right? Like, it is just, these were two big personality people, Clement Mansell and Judge Guy, who should have never run into each other, because as soon as they do, both their personalities explode. You have this like crazy instance of road rage. Judge Guy does not realize that he is like doing this with a guy who is like a fucking psychopathic maniac, and gets gunned down for it. And Clement Mansell just stumbles into this book, not even really fully understanding what it is at first. This is, so the early episodes are about like the cops trying to figure out like who did this and why and what were their motivations. It's like there was no motivation. Like, this is another instance of Clement Mansell just having a bunch of dumb luck. He could have never possibly planned to be able to get something as valuable as that book, and he has no idea what to do with it to actually extract the value from it. It's like not until Sweetie gets involved that there's even like, and it's not even a great plan, but there's even a semblance of a plan of how to actually make use of this thing that is so powerful for them. And so Clement Mansell like stumbles into this through sheer dumb luck and his like short temper and his violent attitude. And because of his short temper and violent attitude, he doesn't know how to capitalize on any of it.
Indeed. And it is so entertaining also in the second half of the show when he and Sweetie fully team up. And like, Sweetie's plan is pretty modest. They're not going to get filthy rich off of it, but it's like a very low stakes, like,
yes.
It's a smart, low stakes criminal enterprise that will bring them a steady income. And Sweetie's got it all worked out. And Clement he just can't do it because there's no flash to it, right? He cannot possibly like do this plan that is like very basic extortion. He wants to be, as you say, going and robbing stagecoaches. And of course it ends horribly for absolutely everybody involved. And then I think you get to the finale, which I think is so interestingly constructed. It actually has some really big similarities with the finale to Justified proper, in that the main action is resolved at the halfway point. Mm-hmm. And what it is we do finally get the Raylan shootout, but it is completely deromanticized because it's based on a mistake, because fucking Clement is so goddamn clueless, he really thinks Raylan will want his fucking cassette tape, right?
Yeah.
Raylan, I think correctly, I think you can let Raylan off the hook for this one, thinks this crazy man who has broken into the house is reaching for a gun. Raylan puts him down because at no point would Clement ever actually pose a threat to Raylan Givens. He is not a marksman in that way. And kills him, and Raylan feels like shit about it because this is not the ending he was trying for at any point, and it's just the overwhelming like uselessness of all of this is what comes crashing down. And I found it actually a pretty bold narrative choice because it is so built on there being a lack of payoff.
Yeah, it's really effective. It's like, because there's so much build up to like, what is this showdown going to be like, right? And they have that, I think it's in episode 6. You have the like, or is it at the end of episode 7? Whichever.
It's at the end of episode 7, the penultimate one.
Yeah, where you have you have like the most classic Justified scene in the whole show that like ends up getting interrupted, right? Where he invites Clement down to this like fancy bar or whatever, and he puts the fucking bag with the gun on it. On the fucking table. I mean, it's obviously it's meant to very directly mimic the scenes you've seen, like the first scene in Justified season 1 when he shoots the one guy in Miami. That's the inciting incident of that show. And then multiple other scenes, like at the end of episode 1, him and Boyd at the table at dinner. Right, like you have these repeated scenes of where, Old West style, we're sitting down, we've got our fucking guns out. Like, I mean, the one with Boyd it's very direct because that's also Boyd has his gun on the table, and Raylan is going to have to draw, right? And it's like that's what a lot of that conversation is about before it gets interrupted and Raylan shoots him. And so you have this like very classic setup, and you feel Raylan has been finally driven to the point where he's just turned into old Justified Raylan, and in the middle of that is when the Albanians show up and kind of jolt him out of that, and they take the guns and all that stuff. And so you kind of get that moment of that sort of, satisfaction of the classic gun duel taken from you. And then what is replaced with it, as you say, is just like, oh, Clement just gets gunned down in the fucking kitchen. And he wasn't even going for his gun because Clement, because I do think at the end of all things, I think Clement really likes Raylan, right? Because Raylan is another guy out of this old school world. And so I think Clement he's having fun doing the threatening and macho thing, but I think he legitimately really thinks Raylan is fucking cool and likes him. And so that's why he's going to pull out the CD and just gets shot. And it's such a I think effective ending because it's the thing that you weren't wanting, right? You want to see the classic Old West gunfight. You want to see it go down like that. You want it to feel clean, and you want it to feel justified, right? Which is the title of the show, appropriately enough, and it's the same way the old show played it. But with that old show, it kind of shows us that shit's not justified. There's always this sort of difference of power. There's always this systemic violence in this larger world that exists that informs and creates all of these scenarios in which this violence is enacted on people. And as brutal and awful and cruel and evil a person Clement Mansell was, it still feels ultimately wrong when he just gets fucking shot in the chest when he wasn't even pulling for his gun. And you want that better resolution. You want that resolution that would have been him standing for trial for his crimes and all. You want to see that be done in a better way rather than him just getting fucking shot down in this kitchen and this totally unromanticized, very brutal shootout. And it's not even a shootout. It's just he just gets gunned down.
And Raylan once said too, the whole finale hinges on how shitty Raylan feels about all of this. And again, it's none of that's really Raylan's fault. He is forced into this horrible scenario because I think what I love about the way the series maneuvers itself for its ending is what it gives Timothy Olyphant to play. Because Olyphant is, I think, as good, if not better, than he's ever been in this season. He is so on fire. If I can just let my man crush show for a minute, he looks so fucking good in this season. The silver hair with the slightly thicker goatee, and then the whole show is done with much more blue tones than all the stuff in Kentucky in the original Justified, which was much warmer with auburns and browns. And it's not just that they've put a color filter on the camera. Everything in the setting is blue. So they often have Raylan here in blue jeans. He has kind of the blue shirt on in a lot of it. And I do think his costume in this season is easily the best Raylan Givens costume. It just looks so fucking good. So all of the swagger and all of that I think is fantastic. But there is just a higher degree of introspection. And I think Timothy Olyphant in the finale of City Primeval is some of his best work because he speaks very little actually in the finale until you're at the end and he's talking to his daughter and his ex-wife and all of that. But mostly the finale starts with him in the back of the van with the Albanians. The Albanians don't mean him any harm. They just don't want him in their way as they deal with Clement. They've worked out this deal with Carolyn, who is kind of going corrupt so she can do her greater good of becoming a judge, is her idea. And they put Clement in that cell that the rich Albanian dude had, and they're just going to basically let him languish in there and die. And Raylan can't do anything about it in the moment because he's in a room full of armed Albanians. And then after that, it just eats away at him and eats away at him. He hates that Carolyn has become this. He hates that he is complicit in this. It's his nightmare of how this whole thing would go. And he goes to let Clement out. And of course, Clement has already gotten out and gone on a rampage. And I think all of that material, as you just feel something welling up in Raylan that shooting Clement absolutely cannot fix, because Clement is not the person he's mad at the end of this season. He so realizes that the problem was never this one idiot with a gun. And I think that's such a powerful thing this season builds up to.
Yeah, it's this whole system that he's a part of that makes it impossible for him to be able to do the right thing, right? And that's part of one of the ways in which the show feels like it is updated, or it's adjusted its focus for 2023 and with the Detroit setting, is while this show doesn't make that specific argument racialized in the sense that it's not a white cop and a black criminal or whatever, but the racial dynamics in the show I think make you think about how this feels like it is that commentary. And it's there's no such thing as a good cop, right? You can't be someone who's working within that system and actually affecting the right outcome, because the system isn't constructed to make that right outcome. And so it's whatever is going to happen here is going to feel wrong and dirty. And you know, that's why it, like, even though Raylan doesn't ever actually explain to anybody his choice at the end of leaving the Marshal Service, you feel it in your bones of like he has to do this, right? He has to wash his hands of this and walk away from it, because there is no way for him to be the man he wants to be for his daughter and the people in his life, and also be a marshal at the same time and be the man with the gun. And it's like, in that, like, the only way to keep yourself from, and for him to from shooting people, is by not being a fucking U.S. Marshal anymore. Because if he's got his gun, he's going to end up in a situation where he feels compelled or justified in shooting somebody, and it's like the only way to not do that is to walk away from that life entirely. And it's like, it is such a powerful ending that they arrive to show movingly through the shape of that plot and the interactions between Raylan and Clement.
Yeah. And it's another reason I'd like to read the book and see exactly what they do with the Raymond Cruz character, because one thing I do know is that the scene with Paul Calderon, which I think is at the end of episode 5, where he meets, it's at the end of episode 5, and Raylan meets him in, like, the hotel bar, and it's a great scene. Yeah. It's just a really good two character actors talking scene. But the story that Raymond Cruz tells is effectively how he kills Clement in the original book, which is that Clement is reaching for a lighter, and Raymond kills him. And Raymond feels fine about it because it's fucking Clement Mansell. But in the show, they've adjusted that. They've brought in the thing where he's reaching for his cassette tape, which I love that that's such, again, an Elmore Leonard detail, and it's one that fits a film or a TV show so well, because you can actually have the music, and you have the whole scene where he's making fucking poor Sweetie listen to it at the end of episode 6, and Sweetie's like, kill me rather than making me listen to this, you know? Yeah. And all of that stuff. So I think that's like an interesting choice. But yeah, it is really powerful. And I want to talk about specifically where they leave Raylan off in a minute. But let's back up and talk about some of these other characters, starting with Carolyn Wilder, who is, again, kind of our one of our main people in Detroit, the person who becomes Raylan's both foe and love interest in a very Raylan Givens kind of way. He cannot have a normal, healthy human adult relationship. And I have not seen Ingenue Ellis in a ton of other stuff. Like, when I look at her filmography, I see a bunch of stuff that I know I've seen her in kind of in smaller roles. This is definitely the biggest role I've seen her in. She's just magnificent in this show. It's a really good performance and a really complicated character who I think you're never sure quite how to feel about by the end, because she is also, like Raylan, trying to do good in a broken system and very frustrated by it, but winds up going in a very different direction in the finale.
Yeah, that she's willing to play the game in a way that Raylan does not want to play the game, right? And Carolyn is a fascinating character, because she also, you know, like, I would say, like, our three main characters are Raylan, Carolyn, and Clement, because you also, like, she's another character that they center a lot of POV stuff on, and you have a lot of scenes and long scenes with her, and that Raylan or Clement are not present for. And obviously she gives us that, like, she centers us in that world of Detroit, because this is where she is from. This is where she has grown up. This is the city that she has, like, committed herself to. Both, we learned that she used to be a prosecutor and she's a defense attorney, right? So she's worked on both sides of that line, putting bad people away and trying to protect people who have been accused. And we've seen how hard she is trying to be good, and how, like, much that has fucked her over, right? Because you also have her ex-husband, Jamal, played by Amin Joseph, which is another just great fucking character. And there's so many powerful scenes where you see how much this life has beaten her down and how much it has taken away from her. Because, like, you know, you definitely get the sense that, you know, she likes Raylan and she's charmed by Raylan, but she doesn't love Raylan, right? And you have this incredible scene, I don't remember which episode it is, but the one where she goes to Jamal's house, and there's this moment of her having this sort of, like, can I be with this guy again? Like, can I go back and live that life and rekindle that relationship? And then she realizes that, of course, it's possible, because Jamal is a con artist, right? And all he's doing is conning people. You know, we don't see that much about Jamal, but it's so amazing how much of, like, a full character they build, even though he's only in really a handful of scenes across the show. But you just get a sense of, like, who this guy is, and he's probably well-meaning, but he keeps on fucking up, and he's always tricking people and conning them, even if he doesn't even realize maybe at times that he's doing that. It comes to second nature to him, and she almost gets conned again, and all that kind of comes crashing down, and there's just such a loneliness to that character, because she's just while she is a part of Detroit, she also lives in this giant like house that's like outside of the city that she lives in all alone. It's a house she can't even afford because it was made through like ill-gotten means through her con artist husband and all this shit that is also holding her down. She's removed from the life of that, from Sweetie's wife or life that we kind of, you get the sense of like, oh, they're important, but it's not until you get really deep into the show after Sweetie is dead that you realize, oh, like he was effectively her father. Like he is actually the person who raised her, and she loses that. It's such a powerful and like really sad character arc to be on with this person that is so good, but all those things in her life have taken so much from her, and she's so isolated and removed from the things that she wants to be in the life that she wants to have. And she ends the season in such a complicated place by getting the thing that she wanted. She becomes that judge. She's able to be in a position where she can do good things, but she's had to cross so many lines that I think you're like meant to think, like, is she just starting on the exact same path that Judge Guy was in? Because she's filling his seat, right? So is she going to be the person who eventually has her own black book and is, making those deals because she's already done that once with an organized crime, right, with the Albanians. And yeah, like it's just such a
and threatened one of the other like judges to like get the position and all this stuff. Yeah,
it's such a great character.
It's such a great character, and it's one of those justified character arcs where you can follow the character logic of it every step of the way and never feel quite comfortable like blaming her, right? Like you can never feel like you can condemn this character because on one hand, maybe she will be much better than Judge Guy. She certainly seems more moral, but she did a lot of really immoral stuff to get there, and who the hell knows? If we could go back 30 years and do the prequel with the young Keith David, maybe he was the exact same way, and we just don't know. And like it's like it is a really fascinating character arc, and I think the final half of the season really goes more and more hard on that character. And it's like episodes 5 and 6 are just as much, if not more, about her as Raylan. And she has all those scenes, as you're saying, with Jamal, and just we follow her through like a day in the life, and we see more of her with Sweetie and all of that. And then after Sweetie dies at the end of episode 6, you start with that flashback, which is beautifully done. It's all fantastic. And yeah, I think she and Raylan have, as I say love interest because like that's the term for it. They're obviously not in love. They have sex, but because again, Raylan is someone who sleeps with people he absolutely shouldn't, including the fucking defense attorney of the person he's going after. Bad idea. That's I feel like something he basically did on the original show several times too, and never ended well. Doesn't end particularly well here, but it is still, it's so evocative. There's so much good acting there. And then, of course, we do need to talk about Sweetie, who is maybe my single favorite performance in this season, which is Vondi Curtis Hall. Again, I love Vondi Curtis Hall. This is such a great, like, complicated role where he is this sort of, he's clearly like one of the best people in the show, like deep down, but he's in this just shitty life where he's had to do some crimes, he's played some music, he's had a bar, he's had a crazy life, he has to deal with this fucking idiot Clement Mansell. I love him.
Yeah, oh my god, Sweetie is just amazing. I mean, there's no more likable character actor on the fucking planet than Vondi Curtis Hall, Yes. And yeah, because I was watching the show like with my dad, because we watched the original Justified. We basically just like watched, we waited until about halfway, the season was halfway done, and then watched an episode Friday night and then Saturday night until it got caught up to the end. But I think after episode 3, I just turned to my dad and said, he's just like, Sweetie's gonna die, isn't he? Ah, shit. Yeah. Like, Sweetie's fucking gonna die. Because I think as soon as you get that flashback scene where you see, oh, Sweetie was with Clement in the past, in that whole like kind of, he was basically like this inside man that allowed this group of criminals or whatever. You don't really know much about who they were, but allowed them to get robbed, have their drugs and all that shit get stolen by Clement. Again, him getting like petty change and not getting the shit that he wants. It goes bad. He guns all those people down. And as soon as you see that, it's like, Sweetie's going to eventually get got, isn't he? And you have the whole thing of the fucking... the Walther P-38, which if you've listened to our Lupin the Third podcast, we're very familiar at this point with Walther P-38s, and what a great detail that's Boyd's fucking gun, that he has this antique fucking...
Clement's gun, played by Boyd Holbrook.
Yes, Clement's gun, There we go. That's the first one. He put it up on marked that up on the chalkboard. But yes, Clement's gun, this old antique World War II era fucking pistol, and that's getting hidden in the bar with Sweetie, and it's just, you knew that Sweetie was going to got at some point. But he's just such the heart and soul of the whole show, because he does represent all those sides of Detroit, right? That there is this sort of this griminess and grittiness there, right? He's willing to go to places and do things that are violent and dark and unpleasant, but also but there's like a reasonableness to Sweetie, right? He's not doing it for fun. He's not in the criminal life in the way that Clement Mansell is. You get the sense that it's like, Sweetie probably hasn't had a lot of choices in his life that allowed him to go other places or do other things, right? And it's like he's living the life that he can live where he can live it, and is trying to do something for this like community and running this bar. And you get a sense of like how sort of comfortable this bar is and how like important it is as this sort of like central location for the show. But of course, he's in with Clement, and it's like there's no way to be in with Clement and not get fucked over. The only thing that it feels like kept Sweetie alive for most of the show is that Sweetie had this connection to these great musical legends and had this whole musical life that Clement aspires to. And of course, Sweetie has detests Clement and doesn't give a shit about anything about Clement Mansell. Sweetie's just trying to use him as muscle effectively. And then as soon as that comes to a head, like that last scene where it all becomes about Clement's music is so perfect for these two characters, where Clement has never seen how much he is hated and despised by every single person in his life, including fucking Sandy. They all hate his guts. They're all fucking scared of him. None of them want to be around him and hate that he has come back into their lives. And Clement's like, well, come on, man, you listen to my music. It's like, fucking hell.
He's so clueless. And Sweetie, while he does die, and that is sad, he also gets to go out finally putting Clement in his place.
Yes.
Once. For once in his life, Clement gets to see. Because even when Clement dies, he looks at Raylan like Raylan made a mistake. He's like, What'd you do that for? And then he just slumps over. He just doesn't get it. That's like the only moment he gets it, which is that he is a piece of shit. And no one likes him or his music or any of that. And he has wasted his fucking life. And now he's wasting Sweetie's too. And it is a phenomenal scene, even if it is extremely tragic. And then the episode after that is when you get the big flashback, which I do have to say, I love the touch that they made effectively no effort to de-age Von Curtis Hall. No makeup, no wig, he's just himself. And I will say, I did last week we had a special screening of Eve's Bayou, which is a film from *97 by Cassie Lemons, who is Von Curtis Hall's wife. And he's in that movie. It's a classic movie. It's great. It's got Samuel L. Jackson. It's just a really great film. And he's got a small part in that. And I did notice, he kind of looks the same as he does now. He effectively has not aged. And I kind of wonder if they were just looking at stuff from Von Curtis Hall in the 90s and were like, we don't really need to do anything. He just kind of has always looked like this.
Yeah, I mean, all they do, because you get it both in that flashback scene and then you get it in the original one with the drug heist, basically. And all they do is they put a bandana around his head, tie his hair.
Yep.
That's it. That's all they do to make him look younger. They maybe colored his beard stubble a little bit or something,
right.
But it's so minimal, and it's great because it's who gives a shit? You don't have
Who gives a shit?
You don't have to train an AI to make young Von Curtis Hall for 2 scenes in Justified City Primeval. It's just let him fucking act it. It's fine.
Yes. Yes, if there's any show that will trust their actors to act, it is Justified, and City Primeval very much lives up to that legacy. Yeah. So we've got all of them. Adelaide Clements as Sandy. I think that's a character that is fairly thin on the page, and I think Adelaide Clements is just frankly overqualified. She's so good, but she really brings that character to life. I think she's fantastic, and her scenes with Clement are just so good. She's fantastic in all of it.
Yeah, I really like Sandy. You just get the sense of her, how in over her head she is with this relationship with Clement, and how, fundamentally scared she is of this guy. She's another example of someone who's, you have a lot of these people like her, Sweetie, Carolyn, that are so trapped in this life that they have, and they just don't know how to get out of it. And I think, Sandy is trying to, convince herself that it's okay, that this relationship with Clement is okay. And I like I like you can see that she's like this reasonable person underneath all of this stuff that has been trapped into this awful life, probably because of some bad choices she's made. But, you have like some of those great scenes early on, like you've got the whole sequence where Clement gives her the Walther P-38 to go throw into the river. She goes to go throw it in the river. She's tailed by the cops and Raylan, and she realizes throwing it in the river is suspicious as fuck. It's like, I love how, Clement blames her as soon as this knowledge gets out that she didn't throw in the river. Like, everyone is like, how could you do that? Like, how it's like, but when you actually watch the scene, no, if she had thrown it in the river, the cops would have found the gun fucking immediately because they were right there watching her, and she's standing in broad daylight at noon on this river, and there's all these people on this bridge, and there's all these people walking by. So she decides, I'm not going to throw it in the river because I'm not a fucking idiot. It's like she's not living in a TV show. Clement thinks he's living in a fucking TV show and thinks that you just go throw it in the river and it's over and it's fine. Nobody will find the fucking gun. So then she goes. That's
definitely my favorite moments of Sandy throughout the season are when she is suddenly very pragmatic, because you get that in a couple of scenes. You get that especially near the end when she tries to get away and she steals the money out of the toaster and then eventually goes to Raylan and all of that. She's actually much smarter than she appears. She's just trapped like everybody else. This is very much a season about people trapped in literal or figurative circumstances.
Yeah, and so her, those times when she gets to be more independent when she is away from Clement, and she's so much smarter than he is. Because the other thing you have, one of my favorite things in this whole show, because it's just so great, is all the shit where Sweetie, it's the first time they're using the book, and Sweetie goes to that one guy who's the bull or whatever. He's this fucking attorney or whatever with billboards around. He's got a stupid nickname. And they go to extort him for petty change. It's a few $1,000s or something, so nothing with this page, and again, Sweetie wants it to be nothing, right? He wants it to be such a low level of blackmail that nobody's feathers are going to be ruffled by it, and so he's intentionally lowballing everything, and Clement obviously is upset because he wants to take everything he can possibly get. And you have all that shit with the painting, and then Clement goes back in and he fucking steals the painting from this dude's house, takes it back, and I forget who the artist is that did the painting, but he's very fixated on the name of this artist and all this shit. And then Sandy goes to go fucking sell it and actually make money off of this stupid thing, and Clement gets mad at her. And it's this you don't know anything about art. You don't care. You don't give a shit about who the artist was or how prestigious this is. Clement Mansell just wants things, and Sandy actually is she probably made more money off of selling that fucking painting than Clement Mansell made on anything in the whole goddamn show. And it's Sandy's, if Sandy could be could actually lead the criminal operation, they probably would have done a lot fucking better and made a lot more money than with Clement Mansell.
They would have killed fewer people and had less of a tail, that's for sure.
Yes.
Because that's one of the stupidest things Clement does is just killing people left and right does not make it easy to do more crimes. So that's definitely part of it. Yeah, no, it's a really good dynamic there. Over at the Detroit police station, we have Marin Ireland, Victor Williams, and Norbert Leo Butz. I think a lot of people know Norbert Leo Butz because A, he has an amazing name, and B, he's been on every cop show. Victor Williams is one of those actors that I look through his CV and I'm I've seen him in roughly 5 million TV shows. He's in everything, all the way back to my childhood. He's in ER. He's Roger McGrath, the guy who is Benton's ex-wife's new husband, and I actually remember that vividly because that's Roger's a piece of shit. But no, Victor Williams, I really liked seeing him here. This is just a really good part for him. I like the really nice chemistry he and Raylan develop as partners effectively on the beat. It's just great. That was my favorite of the Detroit police characters.
Yes, because he's definitely the one who's most on the up and up. He definitely feels like he walked out of an episode of Law and Order Detroit and he was one of the cops on that show, right? It's just he's the closest thing you have to a good cop. Again, he's working for a bad system, but you get this, he's trying to help people, and he's not in it for himself or anything. And then you have Norbert Leo Butz's character, who now I see is also named Norbert. I wonder if that was the original plan, or if they're we got to at least borrow part of Norbert Leo Butz's name for his character, Norbert Brill, who is, this classic violent just a very unpleasant person, a very unpleasant guy. And then, I think like the secret weapon there is Ireland is Maureen Downey, who is that cop that you get good vibes from, right? You have that sequence very early in the show where Raylan and Winnie stay with her, or Raylan, his daughter, do. And you get this as like, oh, she's got a family, right? She like feels like she kind of understands the life that Raylan has and kind of where he's coming from. And there's a relationship, like a respectful relationship that's built up there. And then slowly you get this sense over the show. And I like how like steady and slow it plays it of, oh, she's not on the up and up. And I think it's like they pace it such that like I feel like I pegged it just a little bit before the reveal of like it's like there's something off about this character. And then you have the scene where they almost catch Clement and it doesn't quite work out and Clement gets away, and that's where Raylan's like, what the fuck is going on? Am I seriously watching this dude walk away? There's no way this is happening. Like this makes no fucking sense. And that's when I realized like, oh, there's got to be someone working on the inside. And then it's like, well, it's definitely not going to be fucking Wendell. Like he's a good dude. Like you can't possibly imagine him working with fucking Clement Mansell. Norbert Brill is not smart enough to do that. Like he's just doesn't, he's not that kind of person that realizes like got to be the lady Maureen Downey. And all that stuff as that sort of slowly gets played out and Raylan gives her the gun and everything. It's just like, it's such a great dynamic in the show of this, seeing Raylan's trust in the system and these authorities being slowly eroded away until it all gets pulled out from under him when he realizes he's been completely betrayed by these people.
Yes. Although I like the payoff to the Norbert character where he is a piece of shit. Yeah. Absolutely. He's a bad cop who, like, even is kind of bragging about doing bad things to the very end, but he still has a line. I like that at the end of like the 7th episode, he brings the smoking gun to Raylan and is like, look, there's a lot of guys sitting in lockup who are there for things they didn't do, but I know they did other bad things. But this is too far, and he gives Raylan the gun. And it's like, that felt like very kind of real to me, just on the level of like, I've done a lot of shit, but this is too shitty. I kind of liked how they played that with that character, because it's not redemptive, but it's like interesting.
Yeah, and you get the sense that, like, he really wants to take out Clement Mansell, right? Like, right. Norbert wants to go gun that guy down, right? Like, if he could get the opportunity, he would just fucking shoot Clement Mansell on the goddamn street if he could. So it's like, you get this as like, he actually, he cares about putting bad people away. It's just the thing that makes him awful is that his bad people definition is very broad, and is not going with like the way that the law should actually work.
Yes.
Right. It's like Maureen Downey is the one who she is playing the political game, right? She's the one who wants to get like a cushy seat, and, she understands her reasons. She's got her family. She wants to, take care of them. She wants to get out of that more kind of dangerous ground level role and all that kind of stuff. Like, you get why a person would do this, but it's fucking awful. And she's, putting people in jail on falsified evidence for it. It's just like, yeah, it's bad.
And this is honestly, City Primeval, I think, does a better job with like the main law enforcement characters than the original show did, because the original show has Art, who is great, the Nick Searcy character, and we love Art. But then, like, the other two main characters in the marshal's office are Tim and Rachel, whose names I absolutely had to look up, because they are there for 6 seasons, but they never really become characters. And I think it's clearly something that, like, was left over from the original conception of Justified, was much more of like a TNT kind of procedural. And it became, over the course of that first season, basically because they discovered the brilliance of Walton Goggins, a very different show. But they had these like characters who kind of kept around the whole time. I feel like City Primeval had a much clearer intention. And part of this is they only had to do 8 episodes, but I do think like it uses those other characters who are in Raylan's law enforcement orbit in a much more purposeful way.
Yeah, because you're right. Like, Tim and Rachel, like, just sort of felt like hangers-on in a way. Tim had a little bit more stuff to do because he had the whole background of him being, like, a sniper and stuff that came up every now and then.
And I think in season 4, he gets a nemesis, the guy who's on, like, Boyd's team, who is also an army dude.
Sunglasses, yeah.
That's good. Tim does get at least, like, one good story arc. Poor Rachel never really got anything.
Yeah, but yes, it feels like this show sort of like positions all those characters appropriately, because the problem with those characters in Justified was that like they felt like they're supposed to be main characters on the show, because it's like they're in most episodes, they're in like, you know, the opening credits and all that kind of stuff. I mean, they're billed classically like, here is your cast of like 5 people, that's your main crew. That's just not what Justified was as a show. Whereas Justified City Primeval, like all those, the police characters are all supporting characters, and they are like set up and used in that exact way. So you're not expecting there to be like a huge deep character arc with Wendell Robinson where you find out everything about his past and everything. It's like the amount he's used is exactly appropriate.
Yes, absolutely. A couple other actors to hit really quickly. You mentioned this character before. It's the guy they steal the painting from was David Cross from Arrested Development and a million other things. That one, definitely, I saw him and I went, he has to have been on Justified before, right? That was one of those, like, I had to look it up and be like, no, they somehow never used David Cross. David Cross is a guy who shows up in a lot of stuff. I'm glad they finally crossed him off the list. They got Luis Guzman in there. Luis Guzman is another person where I'm like, it's kind of weird he never showed up on the original show. He's absolutely the kind of actor they would get. Yeah, it's such a good cast, top to bottom.
Because Luis Guzman, is he like one of the other agents, like the...
No, he's he's the officer that Boyd fucks over at the end.
Oh, yes, that's right, yes.
So why don't we just transition into that, Sean, which is that the last 20 minutes of City Primeval, and I will admit, this threw me for a loop at first, and I thought on it, and I watched it again, and I've come to love it. But City Primeval takes a little bit of a zig at the end, where we have Raylan take an early retirement, which actually makes sense, actually. I learned this over the summer because I researched this because I was curious how old Raylan was getting. In the actual world, in the U.S. Marshal Service, their forced retirement is 57. I think it's one of the youngest in all of law enforcement, because the marshals are pretty active. And so that's 57. That's actually in the original series. Art is the the last 4 seasons of Justified happened in 1 year because Art is retiring at the end of it, and they keep kind of pushing it back. But that is because Art is turning 57. So Raylan is actually not that far off. I think if you assume he is Timothy Olyphant's age, he's in his mid-50s. So he takes this early retirement from the Marshal Service, which he was going to have to do soon enough anyway, I guess. But it still feels very meaningful. But then we cut to Kentucky. And we got Walton Goggins there, Sean. Were you surprised? I didn't think they were going to go there.
Yeah, so I had it spoiled for me that Boyd shows up in some... Like, I didn't know what it was. I had just sort of heard, scuttlebutt that, okay, like, Boyd is going to show up in some capacity in the last episode. And I sort of, like, assumed it would be, obviously, like, after the Clement Mansell stuff. But yeah, so I was kind of... So that, like, helped me, I think, kind of process it on first viewing, as I knew that something was going to happen with that. And yeah, but it's a great sequence. Like, I think it is meant to kind of throw you for a loop, because it does, like, if you're taking it at face value, it kind of comes out of nowhere. But, like, with the sequencing of, like, the plot and the themes of the show, it feels super and, like, wholly appropriate. I mean, obviously, on one level, you just want to see Boyd, because it's like, it's fucking Boyd. Right. It's like I understand why, like, for the people making the show, you're like, how can we not have him in there in some capacity? Like, he's so fundamental to Justified that it's like, I understand why you're like, we gotta, like, see something with Boyd Crowder at least once. But, like, I think it becomes so justified to me. I think that was fun. So justified to me in the themes of the show, where it's like Raylan is trying to change. He's trying so hard to be a different person. And then right at the end, he can't quite do it. And he ends up gunning down Clement Mansell. And obviously, like, in the real world, there's nothing that literally connects the death of Clement Mansell to the release of of Boyd Crowder. But in the, like, in the emotional space and the emotional and thematic logic of the show, I feel like the reason why Boyd gets out is because Raylan failed, right? He couldn't really do it. He couldn't prove that, like, his path was perfect, right? And it's like, you just have, because the one key moment, one of the biggest moments at the end of the original Justified is that everything comes to this boiling point between Raylan and Boyd. And Raylan is just like, Raylan wants to fucking kill this guy. He wants to kill this guy so bad. And is like, Boyd, pull your fucking gun. And like, let's just finally do this shit. And Boyd doesn't do it and doesn't give Raylan the, like, satisfaction of having that moment. And Raylan has to accept that he's not going to be able to kill this guy. And Raylan has to walk away. And so I feel like there's something about him shooting Clement Mansell that feels like it is bringing that back, and that Raylan has failed in that way. Not to say that Raylan is a bad person, but again, it's like Raylan needed to realize before this moment that he needed to walk away from this life. And the fact that he didn't see that, he didn't understand that, like, he needs to get out of this, is like fundamentally how Boyd gets kind of like resurrected from the ether, because that's sort of how it's like presented experientially in the show, is like Raylan's done it, like he's walked away, he's retired, he thinks that everything is done, but like, you know, what he has left is unsettled. And so Boyd is like brought back from like metaphorically almost from the dead because of what everything has happened with Clement Mansell, and he escapes. You get this just one kind of like perfect little Boyd Crowder mini movie about how he gets out of jail, which is all just played to absolute perfection.
Yes. So there's actually quite a few things to break down here, I feel like, because we have both the you know, the sort of Boyd Crowder of it all, just that scene on its island as an entertaining scene. You have Raylan's actual character ending, which I think for this series at least, where I think you could have done it without Boyd. The larger point is that he tries to retire, but there will always be another call. And I was shocked when I rewatched the first episode this morning that that's the first line his daughter says to him or it's one of their first exchanges, is Raylan's kind of ribbing her about using her phone too much. And she's like, Dad, you're on your phone all the time. Every time you call, someone calls, you answer. And he's like, I have to, it's my job. And she says, yeah, and she like complains about it. And that is the ending of the show, is him finally having put her first, but there will always be another call, and can he resist that? And that didn't have to be Boyd Crowder, but they've chosen to make it that. And that is, I think, what threw me for a loop a little bit, because now you are stepping on, in some ways, the ending of Justified. And it's just, is stepping on that in and of itself justified? Do they justify that move? I'm going to just make more puns since you've been doing it unintentionally.
Yeah.
And I think they do. I think in the end, when I watched it again and I kind of let it all, and I thought about it for a while, I think it did sit right with me. I think for a lot of the reasons you're saying, for the basic reason of Walton Goggins is the other half of Justified, and it's nice to see him, and that it is like, if you're going to do that plot move with Raylan, that is the number one thing he couldn't let go of, right? That is he knows exactly who it is when he sees the bolo from Kentucky. And it's like, someone's out. It's like, he knows exactly. He knows where, he's visited Boyd. He knows where Boyd is. He knows what this is. And now he's getting the call, and it really is, can he be the guy on the boat with his daughter? And I think all of that works really well, whether this is just the ending or whether they are setting up another series. And I'm curious what your kind of thoughts on that are, Sean. Do you want to see a sequel to City Primeval where they do another Boyd Raylan story? Is this just the end? What happens next?
Yeah, I mean, I think they can leave it settled. I think that's what's like really effective about it is a really powerful ending. That I don't think like this ending steps on or controverts or anything the ending of the original show. Like, I think you could take that ending as that ending, and then this miniseries has its own ending, its own point for this character to reach, and what Boyd kind of represents for Raylan in the show. Like, it is effective. And so it's like, if the last moment is like him on the boat and the phone is ringing, right, and it cuts to black, like that is a really powerful ending that lets you sit with who is Raylan. Like, is he going to answer that call? And it's like, what does this mean for this person? This like character you care about so much. But then it also, so it's like, if they leave it alone, that's perfectly fine. But, you know, if they want to make more, they've proven they can fucking make more. And
Yes.
I just have no qualms about them saying like, you know, we can keep on telling more stories with both of these characters. And it's fine. And I don't think it would like ruin the ending of the original show, especially with like how much time has passed and how like stylistically different City Primeval has been. Like, if they wanted to make another miniseries and it had both Raylan and Boyd in it, like, I would have absolutely no issue with that at all. They have proven themselves able to make more Justified. You can make more Justified.
I don't know if Elmore Leonard has a book set in Mexico, but if Elmore Leonard has a book set in Mexico, I say you take that book and you just put Raylan and Boyd in it and do another season. Because that's Boyd's ending, is he has fallen in love or seduced or both. Boyd never does things by half measures. He absolutely loves that woman. That's the thing about Boyd that I think that whole prison scene gets. is that he's never entirely bullshitting. Like, when he's talking to his congregation, he absolutely believes he's changed and all of this stuff, right? He thinks that's why he deserves to get out of prison, right? He's so into that, and he has fallen in love again and all of that. But anyway, they're planning to go to Mexico to drink some mezcal. I like the idea of there being another season. Let's say we advance the clock by like 5 years. Will is in college. It starts with like Raylan dropping Will off for college. Now he feels kind of listless. And so he goes down to Mexico and finds a town where Boyd is the fucking sheriff or something. Just like a great story where like Boyd has put down roots in some Mexico town and he and Raylan have to do something together down there. That's the story I would tell. I don't know if I really want a Raylan on the hunt for Boyd story, because I think that's been done. But I think there's some version of it where like the goal is, because I think you can't overwrite the ending of Justified in the sense of resolving them as on opposite sides of the law. I want a story where Raylan is no longer a marshal and Boyd isn't really a criminal anymore, but like they're in a different mode of life and they meet again. That's the story I want to see.
Yeah, or you could just like do a Justified miniseries, but it's just Boyd is the main character and like Raylan is barely in it, right? Raylan gets a cameo at the end of that show. And just there's like the adventures of Boyd Crowder, and absolutely have it be set in Mexico, and he runs into the fucking cartel or some shit, and things go off from there. Like, there's a lot you could do, and it, like I mean, if they left it alone here, like I would be totally fine with it. This show is so good though, I want them to make more. Like I want to have more Justified. Like this show is fucking just one of the. I mean, this is the best version I have seen of a revival of a classic show, and obviously like Justified is not that old.
Twin Peaks.
Yeah. Twin Peaks. Yeah, that's almost like a different thing. I don't know.
That is.
Like,
it's true.
That's sort of like a whole different ball game. Other than
I will absolutely give it to you in terms of an actual like full on revival, because Twin Peaks is like mostly a different cast even at a certain point.
Yes, and it's like are you even in the same universe as that original show? For is the open question for sections of that.
Yes.
Yeah, it's like a slightly different thing. So other than Twin Peaks and that sort of weird thing, but compared to like a lot of these other things, like. Obviously I was a big X-Files, or I am a big X-Files fan, and they did like their 2 new X-Files seasons, which are very hit and miss. I mean, the way that X-Files always was hit and miss. But like, there's something about Justified City Primeval that it's like so perfect. It just gives you everything you enjoyed about that old show while still giving you a lot of stuff that is just brand new, but fits perfectly in. And it feels like a lot of that is from their fundamental approach of let's find a different Elmore Leonard novel that is a different kind of Elmore Leonard book that isn't just doing the straight up neo-Western stuff. It is like playing in a slightly different space. Elmore Leonard wrote a lot of fucking books. So you can, in short stories and all that kind of stuff. So if you want to go pull out another one of those and put Boyd, Raylan, or both in there, like absolutely, I will fucking watch it. No questions asked.
Yeah. I think, if you're doing a Boyd Raylan story, what I was describing, I think, is what I want most. But I like the idea that you could also, Boyd is the other main character. So we got one story with Raylan in City Primeval, maybe do a Justified that's just Boyd. I like that idea. I think you could, have them both in it in a different way. And also you can just, I'm also down with them just doing the Columbo thing and bringing Timothy Olyphant back every couple of years to solve a mystery or something. It's, put him in everything. This is the role Timothy Olyphant was put on this fucking earth to play. And that's pretty crazy considering he's also the center of one of the other great series ever made, Deadwood. That man has had a fucking career on television. It's great. So I love this. I would say City Primeval is my 3rd favorite Justified season. I would put it beneath seasons 2 and 6. I would put it above everything else. I think it's that good.
I think I would agree. Yeah, I hadn't thought about ranking it before that moment, but yeah, my instinct is that is right.
The only other season that would be in competition is 4, which is the big mystery season with Jim Beaver. And that one's also very good. I think this is a touch better than that, in part because it is so like tight and fresh and vital in what it does with the characters. Yeah.
It's fucking it's the real shit. It's like they gave you the good shit with this one. That is for
Speaking
sure.
of the good shit, by the way, with Justified, another thing that amused me, this is still an FX show. This show still aired on FX, the cable channel, but there's just F words all over the place. And this is a funny thing to me. This also happened with Better Call Saul, where Better Call Saul was also an AMC show, the same as Breaking Bad. On Breaking Bad, they couldn't say the F word. They finally got, in season 3, the permission of AMC. They could say it once per season, and it would be bleeped on the network, but then they could unbleep it on, like, DVDs and stuff. And that's how Breaking Bad worked. By the end of Better Call Saul, they were saying fuck whenever they needed to. And it's not because, like, the rules have changed. The FCC rules for cable are the same as they've ever been, which is that there actually is no law against saying the F word on there. It's just an advertiser thing. It's just that no one cares anymore. And so original Justified, Raylan never said the F word. New Justified, he tells Clement, stay away from my daughter or I will fucking kill you. And it's just, I do kind of enjoy that as a, no laws changed, nothing else changed. It's just that most people are watching it on streaming, not FX. And on FX, no one cares. And so now people can swear and say whatever they want. And I find that very amusing.
Yeah, because this is definitely like, this is one of the other things that gives it a slightly different texture than the show, is it definitely is like rated R Justified. You have sex scenes in there. You've got the violence definitely feels, there's not as much violence in the sense that you don't have as many shootouts, but it feels bloodier here. And yes, and then you just get the adult language, which, it's that classic, like the thing came up at the beginning where it's like, this series is rated TV mature for like sexual content, violence, and profanity. Yes. I'm like, man, this is going to be a good show. It's like, you always think it's going to be good when it's like you get the trio.
It's funny to me because, like, speaking of like Twin Peaks The Return has more nudity and violence than the original show, but that's because the original show was on ABC and Twin Peaks The Return was on Showtime. Yeah. I kind of like that we're now in an era where shows can be airing 5 years apart on the same network with completely different content. Like another FX show, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, they used to have trouble using swear words and had to be creative. There's an episode in this recent season where they say the C word like 50 times in an episode for a joke, and I assume it was bleeped on FX proper, but I don't know because I can't watch FX. I watch Hulu. So it's just very funny to me how those things have changed without anybody switching networks. It's just no one is watching there anymore, so no one cares.
Yeah, it's the thing that makes you feel the true, like, decline of the traditional TV model is, like, fully happened when just nobody really cares.
Nobody cares. All right, Justified's great. We do care about that. Speaking of another thing we like and we care about, Sean, do you want to talk about Final Fantasy XVI?
Yeah, I had a better segue. Speaking of games that can, or speaking of things that can say fuck, Final Fantasy XVI, which
in English specifically.
Yes, yeah, obviously yes. You don't have if you're playing with Japanese voices, which we did, but in the English subtitles they obviously still use the F-bomb. But if you want,
all over the place.
I assume this is the first Final Fantasy that says fuck, and that was the first Justified that says fuck, and that's probably the thing that is most similar. Justified City Primeval and Final Fantasy XVI is that both of them say fuck.
Indeed they do. It was one of the funny things. Final Fantasy XVI is not a Final Fantasy XV situation where the subtitles and the Japanese are just completely unrelated to each other. But there is a lot of like, wow, there's a lot more color in the English in ways that I find funny. The writing in like 16 in Japanese is actually fairly stripped down and basic, and I actually really enjoy listening to the tenor of it. And in English, they're like, oh, what's she saying, governor, motherfucker? It's like all this crazy, it's very Dragon Quest-esque to me in like the amount of like local color they've given it. But I didn't listen to the voices, so I can't say whether it's good or not.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like, my take on the localization for Final Fantasy 16 is it definitely is in a, like, they are changing a lot of things in terms of, like, it's not a particularly literal translation in any way, shape, or form. It's just that what they are writing is a lot better than Final Fantasy 15 because they're not just saying, let's put puns in there where they didn't exist. It's more they're like, let's try to put what is like the equivalent sort of fantasy flavor, which is, they're kind of Game of Thronesy. Let's like have everything be very Britishy and we'll use our curse words. But I think like the actual sort of like the language itself is good. Like they got good writers to do the translation stuff, which I would not say is typical for Square Enix. It's usually they change a lot of stuff and what they change is just bad. Here it's like if you're relying on the English text, there are lots of like subtle differences between how things are presented in Japanese and English. And if you like compared scenes directly, you would notice that there are lots of differences. But the overall sentiment is very similar, and either version I think are telling a compelling story through their language. It's just that Japanese and English are very different. So I think it's like it is like the first Square Enix localization in a while that I felt like you guys did a very good job on this localization, even if it is a pretty extreme one overall.
Indeed, I think that is true. So, okay, we have talked about Final Fantasy XVI several times on the podcast before now. So we've talked about the combat and we've talked about some of the characters and all that stuff. So really, the conversation I want to have today, Sean, is basically about the story, about where it goes, and I think where you and I differ with some of the Western criticism about this game. And I'll get to that in a second. I do just want to back up and give some of my thoughts on sort of the gameplay side of it, because last time we had a podcast and I talked, I was feeling a little bit fatigued with some of the middle of the game. And I do think, like, if I have one major quibble with the game, I do think its pacing around the middle is rough in places, but not to the degree it kills the game. It's just a little rough. But I will say, I think the game really rallies for the final 10 hours or so. It's got a lot of big, meaty stretches for you to just play with the combat. I think the final, like before you go off to finish the game and they give you a bunch of quests and you get to kind of say goodbye to everyone, do all the hunt board things, play the game a lot. I think all of that is very fun. And it definitely cemented for me like how good the combat system in this game is.
Yeah.
I wish, like, if anything, I wish there were more of it. They've said there's DLC. I really hope one of those DLC is like some kind of big combat trial mode, a la kind of like the Arkham City challenge maps or something. Like, I just want to play with the combat system more in challenging scenarios because it is so rich, it is so varied. All the way through to the end, I was coming up with new combinations across the different Acons, which I think is just ridiculously cool that you can be 50 hours into a game and realizing, oh, wait, but if I have Jill's ice power here and I use Wind Up from Titan, I can freeze the enemy with the circle move and then use Wind Up while they're frozen and hit them. And, like, that's a really cool combination I can put together. And then I would do stuff like, my favorite move I would use for like a super is take I think it's called Lightning Bolt from the lightning one. That is, it plants that big lightning thing on the ground that when you hit it, it'll send stuff off. For a while, I used that with Will of the Wykes, because I would stand near it with Will of the Wykes and it would send electricity everywhere. But then near the end, when I needed big raw power, I would use that with Giga Flare, and I would just shoot Giga Flare at the electricity. I would plant the electricity near the boss, then do Giga Flare on that, and it would do like triple damage from what Giga Flare on its own would do. The combat in this game is ludicrously good, and I don't think the game is like bad at like emphasizing it. It's just so good that I wanted more of it because it is that good.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, I really love the combat, particularly in the home stretch when you have access to all the abilities. And at that point, you also have, skill points where you can have everything unlocked. Like, this is actually something that's very similar between Final Fantasy 16 and Armored Core, is that, like, you can refund everything you want. So it's like when you level up and use skill points, it's more, here is the total pool of points you can have, and you can redistribute them at any point, any way you want. And that becomes particularly significant in the home stretch because that's when you can have basically whatever powers you want, you can have them leveled up to the point that you can have them on any icon or summon that you want, right? So it's like if you want to have Titan powers with the Shiva like fundamental move set that changes your circle ability, like you can buy all those and swap them around. And so you can have like a very intricate customized set of powers, and there are so many different combinations you can do that like I just thought at the end you had so much stuff, and you had learned, because of like the pacing of how you get access to powers, you have learned the ins and outs of all those early move sets by the time you get to Bahamut and Odin, which are the two most complex ones by far, in terms of how like they can interact with things. And so you know how to kind of build everything out and to really play with the synergies of everything. Yeah, like the combat is absolutely fucking exquisite.
It is. And I just, again, if they do some kind of big DLC that is just more space to play with that combat system, I would love that, because it is so ridiculously fun and very much cements for me an uncomfortable truth about Final Fantasy, which is that all its best combat systems are action games. Because I would say my favorite Final Fantasy combat system is still Crisis Core, which is an action game. And then I would say 16, which is an action game. And then maybe like 15, which is like 3/4 of an action game. But 10 is in there somewhere. 10 is the only time I think they've done traditional turn-based perfectly. Yeah. 10 is one of the all-time great JRPG turn-based systems. but it's so good they forgot to keep using it. It's so weird. Final Fantasy is so weird with its combat systems, where I think most of the games actually don't have particularly good combat systems, except the ones that go for a crazy action system. Like, I downloaded Final Fantasy Type 0, which I've been meaning to play forever, because it's another one of the Hajime Tabata ones, and it's also one of the action game ones, and I would love to play that. But yeah, I think Final Fantasy should just do more action game systems, because they're really good at it. And honestly, the biggest flaws, I think, in the design of 16 are just some of the ways where I think it keeps some vestiges of the RPG stuff that it doesn't quite need anymore. Like, I think the crafting and some of that stuff is fun, but feels a little bit perfunctory. I think there's some ways where I feel like they could emphasize the action game aspect even more, but it is an old RPG series, so some of that sticks around. But overall, like, man, they nailed it.
Yeah, and I think, I'm definitely, I'm sympathetic for people who are, like, the hardcore Final Fantasy people who want just your, like, action time battle. Like, I get it, if you're a big fan of that franchise, that's what you want. But yeah, as someone who is like a fair weather Final Fantasy fan who like comes and goes on specific entries, but is not like into the series as a whole, I absolutely think that like the move to the action stuff is overall much better, because they were never, other than 10, because you're right, 10's is good, they were never particularly good with the turn-based stuff. There have always been much better turn-based systems in the contemporary JRPGs that Final Fantasy released alongside, obviously, like Dragon Quest being a big one. But this is so much fun to play. And we talked about it, I think, in the first conversation we had about Final Fantasy 16, but that it's also, like, it stands out next to Final Fantasy VII Remake, which has a fun combat system, but one that is frustrating because it's like a combat system by half measures, and there's just something nice about Final Fantasy 16, just totally commits to, this is a fucking action game. Like, if you like playing Devil May Cry, you will like the action in Final Fantasy 16. That's not necessarily the case for Final Fantasy VII Remake. I don't know exactly who that combat system is for, because I don't think it can please everybody, because it's just got bits and pieces of little bits of turn-based stuff, little bits of real-time action stuff. This is like, let's just pick a fucking system and go with it, and I really appreciated that.
And I guess I'm just curious, the people complaining, like, what's the last Final Fantasy game that gave them what they wanted? Because 14 isn't even really traditional. Like, it's sort of a mix. It's kind of Baldur's Gate-y, honestly. It's your MMO kind of combat.
It's MMO stuff.
But like, I don't know, 13 is technically turn-based, but 13 is another one that kind of feels like it wants to be an action game. I mean, 13 innovated a bunch of the things that the later action game ones have taken, like the stagger system. And so I think like 13's battle system survives mainly in some of the other stuff that they've built around it. I don't know, 12 is a totally different thing that's sort of MMO-esque as well. They're all really different, and I think this one is the one in recent times among the main numbered Final Fantasies that feels the most like it picked a direction and actually fully articulated it as a video game, and I like that about it a lot.
Yeah, I 100% agree.
Yeah. So anyway, all of that stuff is good. In terms of the story, Sean, we've covered the basics, we've covered a lot of the characters. There is a criticism about this game, particularly that I've seen in a lot of like English language spaces, that says that 16 starts very grounded and political and eventually like abandons all of those themes to just do JRPG bullshit about killing God. Is there a better way to like articulate that argument?
Yeah, I think like how I would characterize some of the criticism I've run into that I felt was like, I can understand where it comes from, but I disagree with, is I think that, there's a framework with which a lot of people have been approaching the game, which, yes, is like, the game starts like as a Game of Thrones-y, like political dark fantasy thing that then turns into your sort of like abstract, we're fighting God, blah, 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 like, generic JRPG stuff. And like part and parcel to that, I would say, is like the most common criticism that I find it like interesting that this is like a point for people in this game, is like there's an issue that people have with the way that slavery is depicted in the game, because they think it is not fully explored. That like the game is not able to sort of like show the complex social like evils of what slavery actually is. I've read multiple pieces that's like the fundamental thesis statement on. And for me, I find it just very fascinating, because it's like, because I guess I don't necessarily disagree that like the game isn't really exploring the complex evil of the system of slavery. But I would also say that like you're kind of missing what the game is doing. And I think it's when you're approaching it as like it starts as grounded fantasy and then it turns into crazy JRPG fantasy, I think your like framework is fundamentally inappropriate for like approaching the story if that's what you see the story is doing, because the game is never actually like a Game of Thrones in a substantial kind of way. It is borrowing the aesthetic and some of the tonal stuff of Game of Thrones, but it introduces Ultima like early in the story. Like all of that shit is like, that's right near the beginning. After you're out of the prologue, basically as soon as Cid shows up, Cid is a character that can't exist in the framework of a Game of Thrones story because he's too like positive of a force that is trying to change the world. And Game of Thrones is too, like, the characters in that sort of framework are too trapped within their political systems that they can't think about how to revolutionize them. And this is a game that is about revolutionizing those systems. It is also a game that is fundamentally allegorical. And that, I think this is my like fundamental issue with a lot of the criticism I've seen, is it's people approaching the topics of Final Fantasy XVI's like story and its themes on a very literal level of like saying that the game is about or is interested in exploring literal slavery, when it's like the slavery that exists in the game is not about historical slavery. It is a metaphor for the kinds of metaphorical slavery that people live in the real world that we live in today. In the same way that the mother crystals are not about crystals, they're about like oil and energy systems, right? And like what that affects in the world. The blight isn't about a blight. It's not about a famine or something. It's about climate change, right? So it's like the game is very heavily allegorical. And if you're approaching those things and taking them literally at face value, I think you're fundamentally missing what the game is trying to do and the issues it's actually trying to explore through its story. And that's where like my biggest sort of like disagreement is with a lot of the critical reception I've seen, mostly in the English language space.
Yeah, what I have seen, and again, it's a lot of people I respect have had this criticism. So I am not, neither of us are like, you guys are fucking idiots. That's not our point at all. This is just our disagreement. But what I have seen, I feel like, is a lot of reading into the game things you want it to be about based on some stuff early on in the game without, I think, really taking the fullness of what it is into account. And I see this with video games pretty regularly. I think because they are long and the internet's time frame for things is short. I remember Ghost of Tsushima and all the people saying that Ghost of Tsushima was valorizing Bushido, which is hilarious if you get to the end of that game, where they practically like address the player directly and say, hey, Bushido is dumb. Like, that's basically, the game is like, could not possibly be more black and white about that, but a lot of people just didn't make it that far. And the internet, again, has a very short time frame for things. And I feel like there's a little bit of like, you're talking about dozens of hours of Final Fantasy XVI that I think people are ignoring the other thematic stuff it is building on. I really, for instance, latched onto, I think the game has a fascinating critique of religion in it. And a really like hardcore one in a way that you're not going to see in Western media because it's just the air we live and breathe in. But from Japanese media, it's something they can really address and talk about, I think, in a really fascinating way. And that's something that I think is often missed. And yeah, I agree with you broadly. I think this is much more a story about sort of class and capitalism, of which slavery is a part. And I also don't think, I think I've also seen a lot of like that theme goes away, and I just don't think it's true. Like, you as Clive do not spend 100% of the game going to free the slaves, but you're running an entire underground railroad for it. Like, you are constantly, like, you've created a whole infrastructure, and everything you're doing is to create this system by which that can further and happen, and that is there in the game through to the very end. And like, again, those themes are brought up in all sorts of ways in a story that fundamentally by the end is actually very similar to something like Persona 5, I think, in how it treats the allegory of God and how you kill the god. There's even a shot that's very similar to the end of Persona 5 where we have the camera go through the hole that the hero throws in the god, all of that kind of stuff. And yeah, I think it's interesting where some of that criticism has gone.
Yeah, and I think you're right that, like, I think the thing that, to me, that is telling is, like, the idea that those are themes that the game is interested in at the beginning and then they go away is, like, it's just such a... it's such a weird thing to me, because I think it's like, that's just not how I would interpret anything in the story at all. It's like, at no point do any of those themes disappear. It's that they become more elevated, right? And so it's like it starts at this very sort of like ground level where you're seeing it from that sort of pseudo Game of Thronesy perspective, but very, very quickly it is blowing out your perspective and lifting things up to show that it's like the like sort of the bondage that people live in is a sort of bigger, more like metaphysical and philosophical thing than it is just purely situational, right? And it's about like these larger systems and the larger structures that create the mechanics in which we are all in some form of bondage, right? And again, like, I just think it's like, I think it's like a misapplication of a frame of like your framework to think about the way that this game is using the branded as slavery, that like to try to apply that to like understanding literal slavery or like historical slavery. Obviously slavery is a thing that still exists, but I think when we talk about it, we think about, and obviously in American context, you're thinking very specifically about enslaved Africans in the history of America. So it's like, obviously this is like a very like big and touchy issue for very important reasons. But the game is using the branded, like, we, all of us, the members of the working class are who the branded are, right? Like, it's the people who make the things in society, who use the energy of their bodies to create the things that allow the people who live in the top, the wealthy, to benefit, whether those are like literally the wealthy, or in this case, like it becomes the God Ultima, and like all of us are bound to this. Even the people who are wealthy from a certain perspective are enslaved to this system. But the people at the bottom, the branded, they use up the energy of their body until they become stone, or they rot away to nothingness, because they have used up everything they have, and the system has taken all those things and not giving it back, which is literally what capitalism is. It is literally taking the value of the work that you do and only giving you part of that value back and putting that value somewhere else. And so it's creating a deficit. And that is what this profit is, that people experience a profit, is you're just experiencing the positive elements pulled from someone else who is now receiving a deficit, who's not getting what they are owed. And that's the only way you can create a profit, right? And so eventually that just burns these branded up and they turn to stone. Like, all of that is an elaborate metaphor for capitalism. And it's like, if you're trying to look at it and understand it about like literal slavery and us literally owning people, it just feels weird, because it's also like slaves didn't have magic, right? It's like none of that shit is real. It's like the fantasy stuff is so thoroughly embedded in the full setting that if you're trying to use a very grounded, realistic framework to understand what the story is doing, I don't see how you can do it, because none of that shit is real. It's like trying to look at X-Men and say that X-Men is about mutants. It's like, it's not about mutants. Nobody cares about like actual genetic mutations. Is not what that story is about, right? It's about oppression, whether it's like homophobia, whether it's racism, whatever, but it's about like the oppression that like certain like marginalized groups experience. Like, nobody in writing X-Men actually cares about real world genetic modifications and genetic mutations, because that's not what that story is about. In the exact same way, Final Fantasy XVI doesn't care about like the literal forms of historical slavery and the ways in which people were literally legally owned. It's concerned about the way that we, living in a modern society, are in bondage, and we are being chewed up, and our energy is being taken and used up by this system that's so much bigger than us that we don't really understand and can't even approach, to the point that it becomes effectively a god.
Yes. And again, the thing that I just think is, I think this is a problem of game discourse in the internet age, where you have to have an opinion before you've finished the thing, is that there are like 75 other JRPGs that do this that don't get this criticism.
Yes.
Persona 5 absolutely has a lot of these exact same arguments going on in it. Just to use another Final Fantasy, this is what Final Fantasy VII is. And if Final Fantasy VII came out today, I can guarantee you there would be a lot more anger about how the fact that Final Fantasy VII doesn't resolve the stuff with Avalanche and Midgard, right? There'd be a lot more like, this was a game about climate terrorism and or climate change and eco-terrorism, and they just abandoned that to go fight God. Why did they do that? Why? It's because it is a big like fantasy metaphor, and ultimately it is like the planet becomes this bigger thing that is going on, and Sephiroth, like what he is standing in for, 4, that connection is there. It's doing the exact same thing 16 is doing, in that it is starting very grounded, and it gets bigger and bigger and bigger until you're fighting God, and you're doing like character things along the way to build that up. But like, that's not a criticism I hear about Final Fantasy VII. It's not a criticism I heard about the remake, even though I think it's actually a genuine problem in the remake because of how much the remake stretches out the Avalanche stuff in Midgard, to where now I do have that problem with the game. But like, because 7 is something that we all digested 20 years ago before there was an internet to go complain when you'd only played 3 hours of the game, I don't think that like connection quite exists. And I think that is just something to maybe reflect on with these games.
Yeah, and it's something that I found very frustrating, because it just feels like I had a very like powerful experience with that game, and I really loved the ending, and I loved where it went in the home stretch in particular, and then like wanting to try to find interesting writing about it online was like really hard to find. And I had a very similar experience with Tales of Arise, which is a game that does like very, very similar stuff. Like, it's the exact same kind of story, it's the exact same sort of allegorical stuff. It's just, instead of a god, it's a planet in that game. But it's like, it's very frustrating to go online and just see people sort of just dismiss the really like fantastical elements and the stuff that is the metaphorical or allegorical parts of the story, and just dismiss that as being like nonsense, or it doesn't make sense, or it just gets weird, and approaching the stories that way. And it's like, I mean, if you go into these scenes just being like, well, as soon as something sort of metaphysical occurs, or something that like you can't sort of understand through like pure raw pragmatic realism, and you're just dismissing anything that exists in that sphere, I mean, sure, yeah, I guess the game wouldn't make any sense to you at all. But it's like, there's so much art that like, if you're just looking at this and being like, oh, well, at the end of the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock, why the fuck did you start talking about mermaids? Where did it happen to the dude coming down the stairs and the women coming and going and talking about Michelangelo? Where did the mermaids come from? And it's just like, well, this is art, dude. Like, it's, sometimes things happen in art that should be read literally. And it just, like, the level of discourse sometimes gets pulled down so much by that stuff. It becomes really frustrating, because I do think the core narrative of Final Fantasy XVI, it's like one of the most radical pieces of mainstream media I've like ever seen. Like, this is a game that is fundamentally saying that like the system is so broken and so evil that it should be destroyed at whatever cost, and that destroying that system is going to harm and kill thousands, hundreds of thousands, or millions of people, but that loss is not only acceptable, but is necessary to undertake in order to affect the larger necessary change that needs to happen for people to be able to live in a world where they can be free. And it's like, it is so full-bodied about that. And it's saying that some of these people have to be killed. This system has to be violently overthrown. And there are going to be good people that don't deserve bad shit happen to them, that are going to have awful shit happen to them because you overthrew that system. And that's something that's unavoidable, and it has to be accepted. And that is a thing that like is so rarely, that is territory that so few stories are willing to breach, right? It's like, we are so accustomed to our big fantasy stories and stuff living in this really conservative world that everything becomes about maintaining a status quo ultimately at the end. This is like the fundamental story, like issue with so many of the superhero stories we get, that's kind of embedded in so much of that genre, is that it becomes about these superheroes maintaining a status quo that the radical supervillains are working to overthrow, right? This is the fundamental issue with like Black Panther that keeps it from being like a true all-time historical masterpiece, and like leaves it at like, it's an amazing movie that is like one of the best superhero movies, but it hits a wall it can't transcend. And Final Fantasy 16 sees that wall as like, fuck that shit. You're playing as Killmonger in this game. You're saying this shit needs to be fucking cut off and killed, and man, it's going to suck for a lot of people, and it's awful, but those people are suffering under the system either way, like, right? And it's like the larger harm is happening because the system's being maintained, and the greater good can only be achieved if it is overthrown. It's like, man, it's nice to play a story that actually is like full-throated about that idea. It isn't sort of like cowing away from it.
I mean, honestly, I think it is so radical in comparison to so much media that I think a lot of people just don't even see it. I think a lot of people are expecting to see like the status quo-y story, and when it gets into the like killing God, I think people are just seeing sort of the generic JRPG of it and not all the things it's saying within the killing God framework, which is like out there. Like it's radical to a degree that I don't know if I would sign off on the politics of in the real world, but it's like, I think, a very necessary like story to tell and to think about today. And I was playing, because I kind of lagged behind everyone else in finishing this game, I kept playing it kind of waiting for the moment where it stopped being radical, and it doesn't come. I think people need to understand that. Like there's a moment about halfway through where Clive is offered directly the help to restore the Rosefield line and get back on the throne and all of that. And in any other game or fantasy story, that would be the end of this. That would be the story of the game, would be Clive climbing back to the top. It's the Lion King, basically. Yeah, and that's what all of these wind up being.
That's what the Game of Thrones story would be. It would be about, here is your classic, like, you know, lost nobility of, here is this, like, you know, noble person, part of the inheritor of this family of the good nobles who have been overthrown by the bad nobles. And then you get to, it's all about restoring that legacy. And that's like one of the most classic fantasy story tropes ever. It is, I mean, it's the engine of King Arthur, right? King Arthur, the once and future king of Britain. It's like so embedded in the heart of the genre, and it's something that you just sort of accept as just like, oh, that's just kind of like what these stories are about. These stories are about, in an unintentional way, like reinforcing the monarchy and monarchical principles, and it's about restoring these sort of like lost people who were the good people who had the power, but you don't question the system. And yes, it's like Clive gets offered that. That's like the first movement of the game is Clive and Jill being like, we got to go back to our home now that we're together again. And, you know, sorry, Sid, like your cause is really nice and all, but we got to go like take our homeland back. And they get halfway through there. They're like, oh, this is all fucked. Like, this is all fucked, and it doesn't matter if we restore the Duchy of Rosefield or whatever bullshit. It's like, that doesn't help anything. This is why your dad never accomplished fucking jack shit in his lifetime. He was a nice dude, but he never did anything meaningful, and he got killed because he was defending and participating in a system that didn't care about him. And it's like, oh, it's all bullshit? Yeah, let's go back and let's help burn it all to the ground. And that's what the story becomes about from that point.
Clive is offered the throne again, and he says, no thanks, I'm too busy freeing the slaves. Yeah. And like, I don't know. I honestly would like to know what more you would want. I would genuinely like to know, because it is Clive is given the choice, and he says in a fucking cutscene, no player input at all, no thanks, I'm too busy freeing the slaves and burning down the system. I cannot be a king. I don't want to be a king. He never has that instinct. There's a late in the game side quest with Joshua and Clive about their father that is like nostalgic because he was a guy they loved and who raised them, and they learn he had some similar ideals. But what they take from that is not, man, we need to go get that throne back. It's, we need to finish burning this all down so that this never happens again.
Yeah, that throne room for their father was a cage that kept him from doing the things he knew was the right stuff to do. He knew that what was happening with the branded was wrong. He tried to implement policies to sort of mollify that harm as much as possible within the realm of territory that he could. But it was a cage that kept him from breaking that system. And he was like, I hope you guys, my sons, can figure out a better way to do it. And I don't think he would have ever envisioned or probably even like encouraged them to be doing what they were currently doing. But it's like, yeah, they found a better way to do it. It's by burning all the shit to the ground.
Yeah, again, I would love to see, you know, the superhero movie where the superhero fucks off on society and actually goes and like changes things. I would love to see the serious version of Superman 4 where Superman becomes a stateless being who like takes all of our nukes and throws them into the sun. But that's not what we get. But Final Fantasy XVI effectively gives us that.
I would love to see the Lion King where like Simba gets ousted and all this shit. He goes Hakuna Matata, Timon and Pumbaa, and then he like meets a philosophical hyena that tells him all about like the class structure and the oppression that has been like dominated by the Pride Rock. And then, you know, Simba charges on and violently overthrows everything. He's not like trying to take the throne for Scar. He kills all those fucking people. He kills all the lions on Pride Rock, including his mom, who he now realizes is just participant in all the oppression that was going anyways, and then installs democracy in the animal kingdom.
That'd be great. He burns Pride Rock to the ground. It comes crumbling down around him. That'd be a great ending. Yeah, if they were going to remake The Lion King, that's what they should have done with it. Oh my God, no. I think this is essential to consider. And like the thing that struck me, and I have this lens because for those who don't know, my dad was a Lutheran pastor. I grew up in the church. I've been around this stuff. Final Fantasy XVI is a game about how the idea of a monotheistic God is terrifying and bad and like inherently restricting. And if there was a God like that, we should kill him. And like, I think, and I don't think you have to read the game through this lens I'm about to give, but for me, it's fucking fascinating because the game like really indicts like the entire idea of monotheistic Western religion in the Ultima character and what it does with that, and this idea of like Ultima is the fucking Christian God. He is like the God on high who has created all the people, and he has also created another realm that when the time comes we will all be raptured, the world will be destroyed, and we go on to that one with the slight tweak that in the Bible God is not planning to leave us all behind. But well, a lot of us, I should say, some of us. But anyway, so that is the basic plot. You have the entire long stretch with Barnabas Thalmer, who is basically the ultimate follower. He is basically singing the Bob Dylan song, Gotta Serve Somebody. And he's saying, if I've got to serve somebody, I'm going to serve the biggest, baddest dude in town. And he's trying to get through to Clive like, you're an idiot. You don't get it. He's up there. He's God. We have to be in service to him at some point, right? And there is something, to me, ludicrously radical and interesting that I have never seen in like a piece of Western media of Clive going, no, fuck your God. If the world is this way, and if God is a part of that, then fuck him. We're going to kill him and burn it down because this shit sucks. And on top of that, I think especially because you have that human connection in Barnabas who has given himself over to this, you have another idea that I think is brought in and I think is really important, which is that faiths like systems like that have been used to further every single evil in human history, from slavery to capitalism. Like Christianity was used heavily, like took a root in the South of the United States because of its role in perpetuating the slave trade. That is what it was fucking used for. That was its justification. On to today, the idea of a heaven is promised to people so that they will work themselves to the bone, turn to stone and die, hoping that they will get a good life later on and not having this one. And there's a lot of language, like explicitly in the text of Clive and others saying, we're not working for some future other world we've been promised. This is all we've got, and we're going to make it good, even if it requires us to kill the thing that made us. And I don't know, just as someone who has grown up in a very, like, you know, Judeo-Christian world, I find that fucking fascinating and never expected to see it in a piece of mainstream media on my PlayStation.
Yeah, and it definitely is like, it's one of the JRPGs that I think like it, or I guess it's like Ultima feels more sort of like tangible or grounded in the concept of God in the way that you would understand in a more monotheistic system, which I think is one of the reasons why, it gives those vibes. Like I definitely didn't have like as strong a reaction as you, but I also don't have the same history as you. So it's like, I can see where you'd come from with that. Because it is like, you know, most other JRPGs that have this god-like figure, they're more kind of animistic, or they're like an amalgam of things, you know? Or like, I mean, obviously in Persona, it's all, they're rooted in like Shintoist ideas and stuff like that. I mean, you know, you're literally fighting Izanami, who is a Shinto goddess in Persona 4, so on and so forth. Or like Nyx in Persona 3 is the like concept of death, right? So it's like, that's a not a particularly monotheistic conception, right? Like in those frameworks, it feels like there is room, even if you don't see another god, there is room for other gods to exist. Whereas like Ultima is the god. He is the one who, you know, came to this planet and he created human life and all these things. But one of my favorite parts of that is what it does in how it sort of grounds and humanizes the idea of God, following along in like a long, I think, rich tradition of literature in stuff like Frankenstein that does this as well. There also through metaphor, where Victor Frankenstein is a god figure and the monster is us, humans, is that like, is portraying this God as like, oh, he's not different than us, right? Like Ultima is the most hypocritical motherfucker in existence, and the game is aware of it. Like this is a thing that both Clive and his brother point out is like, as soon as they learn about his backstory of like, oh, like what you did with like, we were the gods and we had magic and we did all this stuff and we were able to create great things using our magic. But when we did, it created this blight and it destroyed our world. And so we had to become, there's a little bit of your classic Gundam, Neon Genesis Evangelion, like they became like thought beings or whatever bullshit. Also, that's always got to be there. Like, no, it's like, you got to check that box. But they did that. And then they're like, well, we got to create a new world. But when we make the new world, we'll make the people. And that'll like help us make the magic and all that shit. But it's like, oh man. But then the people, they started using the magic. And then that meant that the blight happened again. And it's like, ah, shucks. It's like these foolish humans, oh, they're all just covered in sin. And you're like, well, we just did the same shit you did, asshole. Like, it's like, you fucking hypocritical piece of shit. All that we are doing is the exact same shit that the quote unquote God in this context was also doing. And it's like, I love that framing. I love that God is here. He's fundamentally a person. He has done like the same things and is like power hungry in the same ways that these people have been. And like, that is what this whole system is predicated on, is fundamentally this greed and this need for power that this God entity has had, and then the things that he created inevitably would have some of those same instincts and thus create this same cycle that's happening. And I think that whole element, when you start learning the backstory, you just see how completely full of bullshit Ultima is fantastic, because it grounds that character and brings him down to earth in such this sort of relatable way, and it makes him pathetic. And there's something very powerful about the way that sort of turns the tables on him in a sort of philosophical way, where you see how petty he is as an existence, and how much weaker in spirit and mind and determination he is than all of these people that we have been fighting and dying alongside. All like the brave humans are so much better people and better and more compelling, more powerful people than this God thing is. And the only thing that puts him where he is his like effective wealth, that because he's at the top of the system, he's the person that all that profit, all that the deficit in energy that is being pulled from us is all assembling in him. That's the only thing that puts him where he is. In every other way, he's a piece of shit. And I was playing this game when like, Twitter was still called Twitter, but it was on its way to being called X. And I was thinking a little bit about how, the people at the top are only where they are because they just have accumulated this tremendous amount of wealth because the system has funneled it that way, but are in and of themselves stupid, moronic pieces of shit that if like they had to, live in the real world, would have fucking like choked on their own food and fucking died in an alley because they're so fucking dumb. But it ends up that like they're the richest people in the world and they don't understand how anything works. And so they just get to sit there and we all have to fucking suffer for it. And I was definitely thinking about that when I was playing the game and hitting that part with Ultima.
I agree with that completely. Another complaint I've heard that I think is reading it both too literally and not giving the game enough credit is stuff like, well, if all of the branded are the magic users, how have they possibly not thrown off the shackles before? And I have a couple of answers to that. One, that's the entire history of class oppression and slavery. Yes. There were more slaves in the South in the antebellum America than there were free white people. And there is a whole system in place to keep them down because of that. That's what slavery was. That is capitalism. There are a lot more of us than Elon Musk. And maybe it would be good if we all went and found Elon Musk and tore him limb from limb and took all of his stuff that he does not deserve. But hey, that is sadly the world we live in, is where we have created our own Ultimas, where this week we learned that Elon Musk interfered in the war in fucking Ukraine. Because he's a private citizen who can do that. That feels a little like the metaphor in Final Fantasy XVI isn't so much a metaphor at a certain point, right? So all of that. But yes, and this game gets to another moment near the end that is very much a sort of JRPG staple, where you have Joshua, as he's dying, say this to Clive, and then Clive says it to Ultima. The whole idea of like, Ultima is weak because he could have been worshipped and he never was. He never actually wanted our love. He never wanted to have people around him. But you, Clive, you wanted that. You, not in a worship sense, but you wanted to cultivate people and bring their strength together and take their trust onto you and help them. And you are more powerful than Ultima because of that. And that is the central thing. And on one level, that is your very typical JRPG. Bonds of people is the true power, the Persona 4 thing, right? Mm-hmm. But I think there is something extra pointed about it in this game because of its political valence, because of the way it has used metaphor, where like, That is true. That is true. Elon Musk is a pathetic piece of shit because he could have used all of these resources to make people love him or to give love back to people. And instead he hoards it and does stupid shit and lashes out and is a pathetic anti-Semite. And we are more powerful than him because we've banded together to, make things, right? And I think there's so much of that going on in this game where even when it is hitting the JRPG erogenous zones, just the thing that you've seen a million times, I think it's doing it with a more pointed valence.
Yeah, because I do think it's one of those sort of like a fundamental element of Marxism is flipping the conversation on like the perspective that society wants you to have on the way things work, where there is a glorification of like the managerial class, right, and the like upper class and the rich, that like they get glorified, and you say, oh, because they are rich, they must be exceptional. It's like, and because you're a manager, you must be exceptional because you manage the other people. That must mean you are better than the people that you manage. It's like those who own the factories must be better than the people who work in the factories because they own it, right? And that's like the way that's the perspective that the society wants you to have, and you want to sort of like, it makes you want to strive to be the person who owns the factory, not the person who works in the factory. But like the paradigm shift that a Marxist perspective asks you to have is to say, no, that means the person who owns the factory is a leech, right? They are leeching off of the work of the people who are actually working in the factory. But the people who are working in the factory are the people who are making the things, right? So if you like having chairs and you think chairs are useful and chairs are a good thing to have in the world, like the person who owns the chair factory, they don't contribute to making the chairs. They just take the value from the people who make the chairs and put it in their own pocket, right? Distributing just enough of it so that like nobody's going to like have revolution, but keeping just enough of it so that they can become very rich off of it. But all those people who work in the chair factories that are actually making the chairs, those are the people who are amazing. Right? The people who make the things in the world, the people who fix your fucking pipes, like a plumber who comes and like fixes that problem, that person is amazing because they are using their skills and their labor to affect actual change in the world. And it's the people who run like the company that owns the company, that owns the company, that owns the company that employs that plumber. Those people are fucking garbage and they deserve to be fucking, thrown to the guillotine effectively. If you're taking French revolutionary politics or Final Fantasy XVI, like those are the people who are the scum. And that's like the shift in framework that I think in perspective that Marxism asks you to try to undertake. And that's like a really hard way to look at the world at, because like society doesn't want you to see things that way at any point. And so it's one of the things that's really nice about Final Fantasy XVI is that is fundamentally the perspective that it has. It's why I like that you like throughout the whole game have these very menial side quests that I understand why some people don't like them, because they are menial. A lot of the side quests are go talk to this person. That's it. And then go talk to this other person. I love that shit because it's like, that's what actually building the community and being like a part of it is it's like, I just want to be with these people and help them out. And does helping them out mean like, I go hang out with these kids while they're learning how a fucking scale works or whatever and try to do my best to help them? Like, yeah, is that like, quote unquote, like dull? I mean, yeah, you're not fighting a dragon, but it grounds my perspective in like this place that Clive is trying to build. And that's one of those things that to me like made everything in the game so much more powerful, and it felt more convincing to me because the game isn't just like talking the talk, it's walking the walk. It's asking you to be that, right? The reason why that line at the end of the game hits you is because you as the player have actually been working to build that community, and you have invested real time in doing stuff that's not the most like sort of edge seat of your pant like amazing crazy action shit ever. It's just hanging out with these people and listening to their problems and giving some advice. But that's some of my favorite stuff in the whole game, because it feels like it's the stuff that gives life to everything else that the game is doing.
Absolutely. I would agree with that. I think, some of the side quests around the middle maybe like tested my patience here and there, but by the end, I think I felt a sense of accumulation, and I really valued the ones in the final batch of side quests you get, where I think there's a lot of payoff to a lot of that material, and I think it feels like a game that wants you to go play every side quest, because I think it makes the game feel a lot richer.
Yeah.
But to back up a second, like everything you were just saying about that Marxist perspective, this is part of why I think it's such a shame that the game kind of on a narrative level got just completely dismissed in like American criticism circles, because it's the perfect game for the summer of 2023, given that the whole like internet is having this awakening to this in the entertainment industry because of the strikes. And like, if you were not thinking in that kind of Marxist perspective around Hollywood before, I think everyone is now, whether they could put a name to it or not, because we're all seeing the picket lines and we're seeing like how little SAG and the WGA are asking for, and how obstinate the people in the ruling class are to giving a fucking penny to these people. And we see like how just horrible leeches that people like David Zaslav and Bob Iger are. And I think there's just been kind of a veil pulled off of that for a lot of people. And this game is like really cued into the exact kind of fucking labor struggle that we are watching play out in real time, where even on like a fairly literal level, like I think SAG and the WGA have been pretty clear that like they're not breaking on this because there's nothing to go back to. There's no deal to be made because it's been so broken. It's like either we fix the industry through this strike or the industry is broken forever. There's not a middle ground on this. And that's kind of Clive and everyone in sort of Sid's Fortress's entire view on this, is like, there's no middle ground with the fucking Mother Crystals and Ultima and the slavery and everything else. It's either we fix all this shit, even if stuff gets broken along the way, or we don't, and there's nothing to go back to. And that's the world we're in right now. And again, I think Final Fantasy XVI is a really powerful piece of art for processing what we are seeing in front of our eyes at this exact moment.
Yeah. And then also there's the like other aspect of how all those things work, which is this has been like the hottest summer ever. Yes. It is starting to slowly, very slowly cool down just a little bit in Texas. It has, right now it is 94 degrees outside and it's 4:06 p.m. That is the coldest it's been for a while after noon. It has been like over 108, 110 plus degrees most days for most of the day for months on end. Climate change is real. It's here and it's fucking our shit up. And that is another thing that like Final Fantasy 16 is like full on just saying like, yo, we gotta like birth the shit to the ground. Like you are not going to pass like a little law, or not even, because we tend to not even fucking pass laws that say this shit. It's like a recommendation. It's like, oh, well, we should probably, we have a goal to reduce carbon emissions in this way by this year. It's like, it'd be nice to hit that goal. And that kind of shit that we've been doing for longer than you and I have been alive, Jonathan, and have not been hitting those goals and have not been, doing anything to actually like quote unquote fix the problem. I mean, there's no fixing the problem. It's just reducing the harm that's occurring. And so there is something nice about Final Fantasy 16 saying it's like, oh, well, the shit that's doing that is that big thing over there. Fuck it. Let's fucking break it down. It's like, oh man. Oh, it used to be this like that giant fucking like oil farming field is like where all this shit happens. Let's go break all those things. It's like, and if the people try to stop us from breaking them, let's fucking kick their shit up. Like, who cares? Like, they're killing everything. It would be, if some of those people ended up dying, like in the scale of what's actually occurring here, like, that's not that big a deal because they're killing everybody. They're going to die too because of it. So it's like, hey, let's fucking just burn that shit to the ground. And that's basically what the game's saying. And it's like, that's nice. Like, there's something really nice about having a piece of art that's just like, no, it's killing everybody. Again, even them. And I think that's one of the things about capitalism is like when you think about this sort of like whatever like the quote unquote end game is, and there's obviously like, I mean, there's like a century now of Marxist criticism about what is the end game of capitalism or what is late capitalism and all that kind of stuff. There's like a comically large amount of Marxist criticism for a long amount of time about late stage capitalism that I was always trying to like, how do you know like when it's the late stage capitalism? But it seems like the clearest answer to like what is that end point is that capitalism fundamentally accelerates the things that causes climate change, right? And it's like that push for the extraction of energy from people. Like if you're looking at it from like a literally like a chemistry and like physics perspective, like what you're doing is you're just displacing energy in the ecosystem and not giving back or putting back things that create the equilibrium that you need. And so you're burning stuff, or you're like digging stuff up and dumping it somewhere else. And so you're just disrupting the environmental equilibrium to this like ridiculous degree that has never occurred in the ecosystem of the Earth in its entire existence as a planet ever. And so the ultimate result of that is going to be creating a climate that is inhospitable to all the life that currently exists on the planet, except for like some of the most like durable microorganisms and things like that. And it's just like the scale of that issue is so tremendous and has been such a big problem for decades and decades and decades and decades. Like it's been known for such a long time at this point. And so little to nothing is ever really done about it. So having a game that is just saying, like, you have to do something violent to make it happen, right? Like it hasn't happened for 100 years through working within the system and playing by the rules that those people have set, well, then it has to happen by you not playing by the rules anymore. And that's what Sid's plan is. And that's what, Clive inherits. And I just really appreciated a game that was actually committing to saying that is the stuff that needs to happen, is those facilities in the system that is being used, that is destroying this environment, that's killing all the people here. Obviously, in the game, this is all the big allegory of magic and the blight and the mother crystal, but all of that is it's work and labor and like physical, like oil and carbon goods and things like that. And it's climate change, and it's like factories and energy companies and things like that are contributing to this. Like that shit needs to be violently overthrown or everything ends.
And the game sees it through to the end.
Yes.
You blow up every fucking mother crystal, then you blow up Ultima, then Clive gives his life to erase the climate change thing, the magic, the thing that is creating all of this inequality and destroying the Earth from the Earth and create a future. It follows through to the very end. And I guess I would just love for some of the people criticizing FF16 to tell me why 7 is okay, even though they abandon the goal to blow up all the big refineries. And 16 is the one that doesn't follow through, even though 16 is the version of 7 where they stay in Midgard and blow every one of those goddamn things up, you know?
Yes. And you open the map screen and see the giant gaping holes they leave behind as you go through the fucking story.
Yes. And again, I'm actually not criticizing 7. I think 7 is a brilliant story, and I don't think that's necessarily a flaw in it for the story it is telling. But I'm just saying, this is a pretty direct parallel. Like 16 actually does feel like the game made 25 years after 7 in terms of where it is going with the themes, because it has a pretty similar setup and it's got a different kind of follow through.
Yes, and because, partially because it's like, as you say, it's been 25 years since Final Fantasy 7, and nothing has gotten better, and it's only gotten worse in regards to those issues. So, there's more urgency now than there was then.
Indeed. The best thing a president could do for climate change would be to order the American military to fire bombs on every single oil field and oil pipeline on the planet Earth. And that president would go to jail and probably be executed for that crime, and he would have saved the planet. So, Joe Biden's been a much, much better president on climate than anyone expected, or that we've had before, certainly. But that's kind of the bar at this point, sadly.
Yeah, and it's the thing that's just like, if some of this is like all the kind of stuff that just I found like very frustrating after I finished the game, to go like read like, oh, I'm interested to see other people's takes online and have everything be about like, does this follow through on like the actual like historical realities of the system of slavery as it existed in America? It's like pre-Civil War. I'm like, well, that's not what the game's about. Like, it's like, that's a fine issue to have, and I get why it's like a thing that particularly, obviously, an American critic is going to think about, but it's like, how did you spend like dozens of hours playing this game, and that was the only thing you walked away from wanting to talk about?
And even then, I guess, slavery didn't end through the normal movements of politics. It ended through the bloodiest war in American history. It ended through fucking going through the South and burning every field behind us so that we could starve the people trying to enact slavery in the United States. That's what it took to fucking end this. It took holding the South at gunpoint and forcing them to sign a constitutional amendment. That's what ended slavery. Like, there is actually, I think, a certain political radicalism that 16 has that is reflective of the actual circumstances that these things bring about.
Yeah, it's just like the game is not specifically about that issue. So it's like it's not about trying to explore all the ins and outs of that specific system, right? Like the slavery that exists in the game is part of a much larger network of metaphors that the game is using for this bigger critique of capitalism and like nestled within the world of climate change.
Yeah. So, and going back to the whole religion thing just for a second, because this really did, I think, like, touch me in an interesting way because of how frank the game is about it. And again, and I don't even know how much this was front of mind for the people making this game versus it's just a natural output of the allegory. But, I have spent a good deal of my life hearing about, like, the justifications for why we believe in the Christian God or whatever. And if you've maybe heard my voice, I'm not so much that person anymore. My sense of spirituality probably does lean more, like, towards certain versions of Eastern spirituality, which is probably why I, vibe with anime and manga and stuff. But, like, I vividly remember around the time my dad died, talking to, like, the moment where I feel like whatever vestiges of, like, Christianity died in me was probably talking to someone who I respect and who I think is a good person, trying to explain to me their vision of, like, why terrible things happen even though there's a God who supposedly loves us. And I remember hearing that and thinking, this God sounds so horrible and self-serving. If he was real, I would want to fucking kill him. I've had that thought, like, many times in my life when I hear this justification. And I know it's violent and, like, ugly to say, but, like, I don't know. If there is an all-powerful God who can help us with this stuff and he's not, and this is, like, the actual design, I'm like, wow, that person should get got. That's bad. And I just can't tell you how much seeing that logic in Final Fantasy XVI and seeing the characters go, oh yeah, if that's what you're doing, God, then we're going to put you down like Old Yeller, you piece of shit. There's something about that I found, like, it's like having the gaslighting be taken off of you. Mm-hmm. It's like there's something like, oh, this game is, like, telling me something that I've felt for many years, and I've never seen a mainstream piece of media just directly say the thing I felt. Very rare to have this experience with art, and it's something that really animated the closing hours of this game for me, because I think once Barnabas comes on the scene, I actually think it's a pretty active part of the plot of, like, this argument between, well, if there's a God, obviously we should worship him, versus, but everything sucks and he's not helping, and in fact he's making it worse, so I say we should just fire a hole in him. And I kind of like that. Yeah,
because I think that what you're saying there of, like, that, like, Final Fantasy 16 expressing something that you felt for a long time but so rarely see reflected in a lot of media is, like, that's definitely something I felt with a lot of the stuff in this game. That it's just like, oh, I'm not crazy. It's like, it's kind of like, it's like watching Char's counterattack, but it's entirely from Char's perspective. It is like, you're just like, yeah, we're just dropping the fucking meteor. Like, fuck this shit. Obviously, you would, have, like, a better, like, we're trying to actually make a good world, right? Char has a lot of other issues in that movie that makes that a more complicated thing. But if Char was Clive, and Clive was like, we gotta drop the fucking meteor on Earth, dude. I'm like, yeah, I mean, you've got, like, a good setup to help sort of, like, fill the void left behind after we drop the meteor. So it's like, yeah, that's like the problem with Char is, like, he's got nothing inside of him to help, like, create a better future. That's one thing that's sort of touching about the ending of the game is, like, obviously Clive doesn't live to be in the, it's the classic thing. It's like he doesn't live to be in the world that he helps create, but he leaves behind all these people who he's helped empower throughout his journey, and his sick-ass dog Torgal, the best dog in all of video games. He's, like, left those people behind, and, like, you're confident that they will find a better world to build. It feels like a much more kind of full and, like, wholly intentional version of kind of what I felt way back in the day with the original ending of Mass Effect 3, which I know is a very controversial thing, but I really loved the ending of that game. I was very moved by it because to me, that was like what that ending was about, was kind of like this. Like I picked the synthesis ending, which is obviously the ending that the game was like designed around, because the other two endings are absurd. The synthesis ending is about affecting this radical change that totally destroys the entire world as you understand it, but also is there to put an end to this like long-standing conflict that has dominated that universe for as long as time has existed, by combining the organic and synthetic life. And that was like the dichotomy that sort of, pushed that history forward. And Commander Shepard isn't there to see it, but as he melts away, he has a vision of like seeing your like crew crash on some world after all the mass relays are destroyed, and then wandering out, and they're kind of weirdly roboticized and stuff. And it's like, you don't see what that world you've created is, but you know that all of these people you've worked with and been with the entire time, that they will take that torch forward. And obviously in Final Fantasy XVI, that feels much more, even more literal, because your whole thing that you do is you're literally like carrying the torch that Sid left behind for you, to the point where you adopt his name and inherit the things that he had built. And you're just doing that, and like, Gav or Jill or somebody is going to be the next Sid, and they will like carry forward in that new world. And all that stuff in the ending I just found incredibly touching, and felt like it's like, I think it just nailed that landing so perfectly, where all of these ideas and all of the themes of what you're fighting for and what you're fighting against come together, and that sacrifice that Clive makes feels so beautiful, and what is left behind, you have this like real profound sense of hope that sort of persists after you are gone. It's a really powerful ending, and I loved it so much.
I couldn't agree more. I loved it. I think it's extra strong with a lot of the side quests near the end, like your final side quest with Gav, where it's just about Gav trying to help that pregnant lady that you find on Ash and you've brought back. And it's a very like literal like life goes on kind of thing, right? It's this reminder for Clive that like there will be babies born in this new world. There will be life moving on. But also like you and Gav, I didn't even realize how much I liked Gav as a character until you're having drinks with him and talking about everything. And Clive kind of clams up for a second and says, hey, if I don't make it back from this, like, you're the next Sid. Like, basically, says that directly. And Gav kind of cuts the tension by saying, I guess I get your sword in your room. But it's like, it is beautiful. Like, you see that they've built an actual community because Clive, everyone's ready. Like, Clive knows that if he doesn't make it back, it's okay. Like, they've built a robust, functioning community that is outside all of these political systems. I mean, that's one of the interesting things also, is that as you go around destroying the mother crystals, every single one of those civilizations is also destroyed. Like, all of their political leadership is gone. A lot of them are thrown into, like, effectively anarchy. And yet, as all of that is happening, the sort of the homestead, the main area in the center of the map where you live with all of Sid's people, gets bigger and bigger and more like a real functioning, effectively communist society, yes. Right? Where everybody works together on an equal plane, and you see that thing made. So it is not just about destroying things, but also about building things, and there's a lot of that there. And I found the ending so tremendously touching. There's so many beautiful moments. The scene as you like say, okay, now I'm doing the ending of the game, and you go off to that, you have the big scene where you say goodbye to everybody. And this is one of several times where this game, Masayoshi Soken, the composer, does a version of the setting out theme from Final Fantasy I, the theme as you like start your journey. I think there's 3 or 4 versions. There's like a big version, there's a sad piano version, there's a sad string version, and then this is the fullest like orchestral version we've ever heard as they truly head out. And I think something about having that song be something you build up to over 60 hours of gameplay instead of the thing you get 30 minutes into the game is like something really beautiful, because it's one of Nobuo Uematsu's most beautiful and enduring pieces of music, and it being the thing that you play here when you have built a community and you are leaving it behind to go save that world. Like that piece of music has never hit me that hard. And obviously the soundtrack to this game we could do a whole podcast on, because it is endlessly brilliant and is constantly telling the story beautifully. But that moment hit me really fucking hard. And then everything with Joshua and Clive and that exchange. Like that's like Full Metal Alchemist level, like great brother storytelling, where you have Joshua die for Clive. And it is unbelievable scene. And also, if you did not play in Japanese, the voice actor for Clive in the scene where Joshua dies his emoting is almost uncomfortable how raw it is. Do you know what I mean, Sean? It's almost like, oh my God, should I be here? This is private. This isn't for me, is it? It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, Uchida Yuya, who does the voice for Clive, is so fucking good. And because he's such a stoic character, and he's so soft-spoken, right? He's like, Clive is this big puppy dog man, and I fucking love him to death. And so there's not a lot of moments where he emotes so strongly. And I do think this is one of the differences from clips I've seen of the English version, which is kind of like, I think is just generally true, where it's like, the English is going to be a little bit more forceful. But the kind of the trope of character with which Clive exists in Japanese is going to be much more taciturn, and like he just feels like he plays his cards and holds his cards very close to his chest most of the time. But when there's an outpouring of emotion, it's very powerful. And that when Joshua dies, it's brutal. Like, I just remember, like, as the opening credits played, I just went like, oh, what did you do to my boys? What did you do to my boys, my beautiful boys? Because it's like, they're just the two best boys in the world. They're like these puppy dog boys that they're so great, and they're just so sweet, and they're such good, kind people who have been through such bullshit. And it definitely on that sort of like pure, sort of like melodramatic, emotional level. That relationship between the two brothers, I think, is super powerful. And them having to be apart for so long. And there's just so much stuff that's so powerful, particularly in the beginning section of the game when Clive still thinks that Joshua's dead. You have that pretty early scene where he has the first time he has realized that he is Ifrit, and thinks that he killed his brother, which of course he didn't kill his brother, though he did, brutalize his brother. And he is like chained up naked because Sid doesn't know what to do with this dude, and Sid's probably scared shitless also, because it's like, what, this dude just turns into Ifrit again? That's not going to be good. And it's like that sense of like despair Clive has, and him kind of pulling himself up from that. There's just all those moments where Clive is pushed into a really dark or very powerful emotional space. I think is like, you see how nuanced and effective that vocal performance is.
Absolutely. And just that final exchange where Joshua, I already talked about this speech that Joshua gives about like why Ultima is weak and why Clive is strong and bonds of people is the true power and all of that, and then dies. Unbelievably powerful. You have all of Clive, picking himself back up and finishing the job, and then Clive reciprocating. This moment very much feels like kind of like specifically 2003 Full Metal Alchemist to me a little bit, the ending where Edward sacrifices himself to save Alphonse, but like you have him use the Phoenix powers, bring Joshua back, and then use his powers to destroy all of the magic and all of Ultima's stuff. And it's just, and like and you can see Clive is so at peace because he's able to bring his brother back, and he knows that Jill and everyone else is down there, and he's able to let go. And it hit me really, really hard. And I think it's a beautiful ending. I think it's so evocative that I think they do like a really touching romance between him and Jill, and they also kind of have the stones to let it ends tragically, sadly. Like, Jill is going to have to go on without him, but it's okay in the end. The world is going to move on. And then you have that post-credits scene that I think is so economical and effective in communicating these ideas, where you have the kid who has to start a fire without magic. And it's just this little symbol of, again, the entire, like, yes, maybe one day, if we beat climate change and capitalism, some things in our life are going to be less convenient, but we will be alive. And things will be okay, and it will be green outside. And all of that horrible shit that happened might be in a fucking book called Final Fantasy written by Joshua Rosefield. It's perfect. I know it's kind of on the nose, but it appears to be on the nose in ways a lot of people aren't understanding, so that's fine.
Yeah, I mean, it's the thing, again, it's so much when I was playing Final Fantasy XVI, I thought about Tales of Arise, because they're both these big allegorical, crazy JRPGs that have very memorable characters that tell these very emotional stories that also are delivering like these big in your face, like, we have written what the metaphor means on a big fucking like piece of paper and slapped you in the face with it. And yet so much of the like conversation I saw around it online was just like, did you not look at the piece of paper when it was slapping you in the face? Like, did you not see the metaphor? And it's like, I think it's like, this is one of the things that makes it feel like why I'm using the word allegory specifically is because allegory historically is used for that exact purpose of like, it is meant to be so obvious. I mean, like the most traditional versions of allegory, which are typically Christian, are like, we have literally named, this is faith. Oh, and here's pride. And look over there is the character named Envy. And not in a Full Metal Alchemist way, in a, like, literally that is just what the characters are. Full Metal Alchemist doesn't even really have a lot of those homunculi even be that much like their sins. But it's traditionally allegory is, here are characters or locations that are called what they are, and they literally are meant to be understood as that thing. This, like, location is literally meant to be understood as this thing. Like, this character is literally meant to be understood as the concept of faith made literal in a character in a piece of fiction. And that's effectively what Final Fantasy XVI is doing, right? You are meant to literally read magic and the mother crystals and all of that stuff as oil / like all of our sort of forms of energy we currently use that our society runs on that is also destroying the world in which we exist. Like, it's so in your face with it. There's kind of no real way to approach the story without seeing that it's like you can't, there's just nothing else there. I mean, they might as well just, instead of calling them mother crystals, had them be giant crystals that were called the oil fields. And they just looked this like, we got to go destroy the oil field and point at a giant crystal. That's the only way you can make it more of a literal allegory. And it's like, allegorical storytelling isn't super in fashion these days. Lots of people are very like grounded, hardcore realism stuff. I mean, that's like what the Game of Thrones thing is, right? It's like taking fantasy and sort of dragging a lot of the fantasy out of it and making it more a piece of historical fiction, just with like all the names sanded off, and we don't call them Lancaster and York, we call them whatever the fuck whatever. But I like going to this sort of ridiculous high fantasy allegorical stuff. I think it feels appropriate for the moment we live in right now, and it also just gives like a very kind of a different taste, a different flavor, some like variety to the kind of media you consume, to have something that is playing in this high fantasy allegorical space. And I'm very excited for, we've brought up Persona a couple times here. But the fact that the Persona team's next game is literally just called fucking Metaphor makes me pretty excited. I'm guessing it's probably also going to be a piece of allegory. I'm pretty sure that Metaphor Refantagio is just going to be a giant fantastical allegory for shit. And I'm so far, I'm 2 for 2 on those. I played Tales of Rise and Final Fantasy 16, and I love both those. So give me some more JRPG big allegories, and I'll be a happy camper.
Well, and like, I think Persona 5 is less in the space of allegory, but politically it's engaged in a very similar way to these games. It would be kind of another pillar of that trio to me. And yeah, I agree. I definitely think I have more of an appetite for unsubtle art today. I think there's something about, like, I think it was more in vogue 15 years ago to be like, you can't be that on the nose with it. Like, your villain has to be more complex. And I don't know, in a world with fucking Donald Trump, maybe your villain doesn't need to be complex. Maybe your villain is really that bad and it just needs to be taken down. Like, it was even like something where I think I saw this complaint when Avatar 2 came out of like people didn't like that they brought the Stephen Lang character back and have some of that. I'm like, here's the thing. The Stephen Lang character is the most brilliant thing in all of Avatar, because that is like James Cameron using his powers for good in terms of like having these big, bold pop culture statements that are not subtle at all, but I actually think feel pretty reflective of the world we live in. And the Avatar, The Way of Water has a bunch of whalers being assholes and then getting fucking killed by a big whale who's cool. That's not subtle. It sure feels good. I like that. There's something about some of that kind of storytelling that I think is valuable now, and absolutely FF16 is working in that space. This game is great, and the more we talk about it, the more I am convinced of that. It has a couple of warts here and there, but man, this is what I said last night. This is a game of like almost incomprehensible ambition in places, and it is the rare work of art that I think really can rise to its own ambition in terms of its story, in terms of its visuals and technical qualities, in terms of its music, in terms of its characters. It feels like a game you plop down $70 for and get more than that back in entertainment value and ideas and vision and imagination, and that feels pretty fucking cool.
Yeah, and you just get such a kind of complete package, I mean, obviously they've announced they're going to do DLC stuff. I'm curious to see that. I hope that there's like I want like a Jill campaign. I don't know if that's set afterwards or it's like sometime during it, but like Megami Han is so good. I think the number one reason to do the Japanese voices, honestly, is her performance as Jill. Like all the other actors are obviously amazing in the Japanese voices as well, but from what I've heard of the English performances, they're all really good also in English. And the lady who plays Jill also sounds good, but like Megami Han is so fucking good as Jill in this game that it's like, it's probably my biggest criticism of the game is that like I just wish there was more Jill stuff in it. And I feel like because they wanted the ending they wanted, Jill kind of gets sidelined a little bit in terms of the main action near the end. And I kind of like wish that she was more central. But again, like I get one of the big reasons why is that she would have to be dead because everyone died that went on the mission. So she has to stay at home. But the way to fix that problem is just make a Jill campaign. Give Megami Han that, you know, have somehow Jill gets the ability to also use other Acons for like a day or something and just make a campaign about what happens on that because I want to play as her.
I would love that. I think she's phenomenal. And the moment that like got me maybe harder than anything in the finale is in the incredibly lush pre-rendered cutscene that ends the game.
Yes.
When the baby is being born and Jill is there in the room and she looks out the window and sees the moon and she just has a sense that Clive is dead, and the tears start coming like without her, I think, before she even realizes what she's feeling. Mm-hmm. Unbelievably powerful scene. Gav picks up on it, and then you have Torgal, the dog among dogs, who howls at the moon for his master. Just it's such a perfectly executed moment. And yes, I think a Jill campaign would be the obvious thing to do because she is awesome. But there are still some great scenes with her. The scene where she gives her Acon powers to Clive is very memorable. It feels like this game kind of self-consciously doing the scene in the pool in 10, for 2023. And actually this game is doing that over and over where it's updating old Final Fantasy moments. It's another thing I really love about this game is if you're a longtime fan, it has a lot of nice nods that don't feel like they're getting in the way, but feel like very intentional homages. And that's one of the good ones, too. But yes, Megami Han sounding an awful lot like her mother, like Lala Soon. She's great.
Yeah. But then also the other thing I was going to say when I got on the Megami Han tangent, which is a good tangent to go on, is that there's something nice about Final Fantasy 16. And I'm feeling this right now also with Armored Core 6, where it's just like such a nice, full, rounded package of a game, where that's like just a rarity these days. There have been lots of really good games that have come out this year, but a lot of them, like Jedi Survivor, which is a game I liked, and I don't think, at least on PS5, Jedi Survivor had as many technical problems as it got a reputation for. I think that version got a lot of flack that like the PC version had left over, that like people kind of just shat on that game as a whole technically. And it's like, if people want to play Jedi Survivor on PS5, just put on 30 frames per second mode and you're fucking totally fine. But like, but it was rougher than Final Fantasy 16. Although also a game you should put on 35 frames per second mode, just you're fine with it. But it's like the game as a whole is just like, it's so technically smooth. I never had any like glitches or issues. I played it on 30 frames per second, but I think like the motion blur is so good on this game. And the input lag itself is so low that even though the frame rate is going to add some input lag, like I never like felt like it debilitated my ability to engage with the combat. The graphics look so nice. The music is fucking incredible. Just like such a stacked, incredible soundtrack that has such variety to it. It's just top to bottom is such a polished product. And it's just very appreciated because you just don't get a lot of those these days in games. When you get one, you got to cherish it.
Absolutely. So I don't know if I have anything, I'm just going to cut it there. That's fine. We're good. That's it.
Oh, they're going to cut the podcast there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Did you have more to say? I don't know. That felt good to me. That felt like a good ending.
Should I click stop on my recording?